Hello 大家好，今天，哎呦妈呀，等会儿，就是怎么说呢？还有一个还在继续看完。如果你们想要一起看呢，还是说，就是我们先做我们的就是本来的那个 agenda 过一遍，20分钟过了一遍以后再看。呃，问一下大家，大家如果想一起看的话，我们就一起看完以后再做我们的 agenda。稍等一下啊。对，然后做那个我们做一起看，好的，那也行。
To policy and enforcement specialists. Sort of does beg the question who these enforcement specialists are. Enforcement is done in the tool Athena, the Ares manual review tool. So you said to Congresswoman Lofgren that there was no manual review tool, and then your documents indicate that there is a manual review tool. So help us understand the inconsistency.
Congressman, there are two parts to this. In general, we algorithmically approach our search results. We have robust policies to do so, and we test it both with user feedback and we use raters to validate. Last year alone, we ran over 300,000 experiments and launched around 3,000 improvements to search. We generally approach it algorithmically. However, in order to comply with the law in every country we operate in, for example, there may be an actor or a website identified as interfering in elections. And we then have to put that site on a list so that doesn't appear in our search results against queries. So other examples would be violent extremism.
And is that done manually, Mr. Pichai? That process you described, is that done manually?
And we could get reports from law enforcement agencies. We are complying with, or it's a known DMCA-based.
There is either a manual component or there is not a manual component. Which is it?
For creating those lists, that process can involve manual portions.
Okay, great. Well, that is sort of the concern that I have. You've now said something different today than you said to Ms. Lofgren, because you've confessed that there is a manual component to the way in which you blacklist content. And it seems to be no coincidence that it's sites like Gateway Pundit, The Western Journal, American Spectator, Daily Caller, and Breitbart that receive the ire or the negative treatment as a consequence of your manual tooling. And it also seems noteworthy that whistleblowers at your own company have spoken out. You said that one of the reasons you maintain this manual tool is to stop election interference. I believe it is, in fact, your company that is engaging in election interference. And it's not just my view. Mike Wacker came out and was a whistleblower indicating that the manual blacklist targets that Google specifically goes after are those who support President Trump, who hold a conservative viewpoint, and he left your company in 2019 because he was speaking out against these outraged mobs. So can you see how when you empower individuals, some of the same individuals that Project Veritas has exposed as labeling people as terrorists who say make America great again or who support the president, that in fact can be the very election interference that we're concerned about, and that you're using your market dominance in search to accomplish that election interference?
Congressman, with respect, I strongly disagree with that characterization. We don't approach this work with any political viewpoint. We do that to comply with law, known copyright violations, very in narrow circumstances, and we have to do that to comply with the law. And in many cases, those requests can come from law enforcement agencies.
Your own employees are saying you're doing it for a different reason. Your own employees are saying it's political bias. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr.
And I'm sorry, may I be recognized for unanimous consent request?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, just given the productivity of our discussion, I'd request that we be permitted a third round of questioning.
Without objection. I now recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Nadler.
Yeah. The documents prove it. The news and journalism industry in this country are an economic freefall. Over 200 counties in America no longer have a local newspaper, and tens of thousands of journalists have been laid off in recent years. The reason journalism is in freefall is that Google and Facebook now capture the vast majority of digital ad revenue. Although news publishers produce valuable content, it is Google and Facebook that increasingly profit off their content. Publishers have told us that Google and Facebook maintain their dominance in these markets in part through anti-competitive conduct, as well as conflict of interest. Mr. Zuckerberg, in 2015, Facebook reported high and quickly growing rates of video viewership on its platform. Based on these metrics, news publishers fired hundreds of journalists, choosing instead to boost their video divisions. In 2018, it was discovered that Facebook had inflated these metrics and had known about the inaccuracies several years before Facebook publicly disclosed this. Mr. Zuckerberg, did you know that these metrics were inflated before they were publicly released?
Congressman, no, I did not, and we regret that mistake and have put in place a number of other measures since then to make sure that we...
And do you realize the harm that this caused journalists across the country?
Congressman, I certainly know how important it is that the metrics that we report are accurate, and we've put in place additional measures to make sure that we can audit those.
And what do you have to say to the journalists who lost their jobs because of Facebook's deception?
Well, Congressman, I disagree with that characterization and also your description of what...
Reclaiming my time. Google, meanwhile, maintains its dominance in part through aggregating data from across its products and services. Mr. Pichai, I understand that Google collects user data on users' browsing activity through its Chrome browser. Does Google use that data for its own purposes, either in advertising or to develop and refine its algorithms?
Mr. Chairman, we do use data to improve our products and services for our users. Anytime we do it, we believe in giving users choice, control, and transparency. We make it very clear, and we give them simplified settings to choose how they like their data to use.
And so you do use the data that you get from these companies for your purposes.
My understanding was whether we use data in general to improve our products and services, and we do use data to show ads, but we give users the choice. They can turn ads personalization on or off.
Now, this obviously, the use of this data from all these companies gives you a tremendous advantage over them and over any competitor. Does the ability to make money in any way affect Google's algorithm in terms of what news appears in a typical user's search results?
The way we rank our search results, we don't take into account commercial relationship that we have.
Okay. But Facebook and Google have gravely threatened journalism in the United States. Reporters have been fired, local newspapers have been shut down, and now we hear that Google and Facebook are making money over what news they let the American people see. This is a very dangerous situation. And unfortunately, my time has expired and I have to yield back.
Thank the gentleman for yielding.
I'm discussing hydrochloroquine and discussing the not dangers of children returning to school. And when I clicked on the link, it was taken down. And then I was sent a different link on YouTube and it was taken down. I just checked again just to make sure. And it says that this video has been removed for violating YouTube's community guidelines. How can doctors giving their opinion on a drug that they think is effective for the treatment of COVID-19 and doctors who think it's appropriate for children to return back to school violate YouTube's community guidelines when all of these videos of violence is all posted on YouTube?
Congressman, we believe in freedom of expression, and there is a lot of debate on YouTube about effective ways to deal with COVID. We allow robust debate. But in the area during a pandemic, we look to local health authorities. So for example, in the US, it would be CDC for guidelines around medical misinformation in a narrow way, which could cause harm in the real world. And so for example, if there is aspects of a video, and if it explicitly states something could be a proven cure, and that doesn't meet CDC guidelines,
It's free expression of speech, and you have these doctors who are giving their opinion as doctors, and I don't understand why YouTube and therefore Google thinks it's appropriate to silence physicians and their opinion of what can help and cure people with COVID-19. I'm going to switch quickly to Mr. Zuckerberg. I think at this point it's fairly obvious that technology platforms have been stifling conservative news and opinions. You employ a panel of content moderators. Can you explain how Facebook chooses who these moderators are?
Thanks, Congressman. We do hire a lot of people around the world to work on safety and security. Our team is more than 30 or 35,000 people working on that now. We certainly try to do this in a way that is neutral to all viewpoints. We want to be a platform for all ideas. I don't think you build a social product with the goal of giving people a voice if you don't believe that people being able to express a wide variety of things is ultimately valuable for the world. And we try to make sure that our policies and our operations ultimately reflect and carry that out.
Is there an ideological diversity amongst the content moderators?
Congressman, I don't think we choose to hire them on the basis of an ideology. They're hired all over the world. There's certainly a bunch in the U.S. There's diversity in where they're hired, but certainly we don't want to have any bias in what we do, and we wouldn't tolerate it if we discovered that.
So you don't specifically hire, say, conservative moderators and Democrat or liberal moderators so that there's a balance in your content moderators?
Congressman, in terms of the 30 to 35,000 people or more at this point who are doing safety and security review, that is correct. In terms of the people setting the policies, I think it is valuable to have people with a diversity of viewpoints involved so we can make sure that we have the different viewpoints represented in the policy development process. And we also consult with a number of outside groups whenever we develop new policies to make sure that we're taking into account all perspectives.
What are some of those outside groups that would be conservative leaning?
Congressman, I need to get back to you with a list of specific groups, but it would depend on what the topic is.
Can you just think of one? I mean, you said you reach out to outside groups. Can you think of one conservative outside group that you reach out to and use as a content moderator?
Congressman, I'm talking about different external stakeholders and groups that are inputs to our policy development process. And I'm not involved in those conversations directly, so I would have to get back to you with specifics on that. But I'm quite confident that we speak with people across the ideological spectrum when we're developing our policies.
I would very much appreciate a follow-up on that. Real quickly, can you briefly explain the approval process for third-party fact checkers, and how many fact checkers does Facebook employ?
Yes, thanks. We work with about 70 fact-checking partners around the world, and the goal of the program is to limit the distribution of viral hoaxes, so things that are clearly false, from getting a lot of distribution, but we don't ourselves want to be in the business of determining what is true and what is false. That feels like an inappropriate role for us to play. We rely on an organization called the Pointer Institute, and I think it's called the Independent Fact-Checking Organization, that has a set of guidelines of what makes an independent fact-checker, and they certify those fact-checkers, and then any organization that gets certification from that group is qualified to be a fact-checking partner within Facebook.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. We're going to I'm going to recognize Mr. Johnson for 5 minutes, and then we're going to take a short break of the committee. Mr. Johnson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bezos, Amazon has a significant problem with counterfeit products being sold on its platform. Counterfeit products not only rip off the owners of legitimate businesses, they also can be dangerous. Counterfeit medicine, baby food, automobile tires, and other products can kill. Amazon has said it's fixing its counterfeit problem, but Counterfeiting seems to be getting worse, not better. Amazon is a $1 trillion company, but Amazon customers are not guaranteed that the products purchased on your platform are authentic. Amazon acts like it's not responsible for counterfeits being sold by third-party sellers on its platform. And we've heard that Amazon puts the burden and cost on brand owners to police Amazon's site, even though Amazon makes money when a counterfeit good is sold on its site. More than half of Amazon's sales come from third-party seller accounts. Why isn't Amazon more aggressive in ensuring that counterfeit goods are not sold on its platform? And why isn't Amazon responsible for keeping all counterfeit products off of its platform?
Thank you. This is an incredibly important issue and one that we work very hard on. Counterfeits are a scourge. They are a problem that is not, it does not help us earn trust with customers. It's bad for customers. It's bad for honest third-party sellers. We do a lot to prevent counterfeiting. We have a team of more than 1,000 people that does this. We invest hundreds of millions of dollars in systems that do this. We have something called Project Zero, which helps brands serialize individual products, which really helps with counterfeiting.
Well,
we have
I'm glad that
other
you have
programs
those
as well.
I'm glad that you have those features in place, but why isn't Amazon responsible for keeping all counterfeit products off of its platform?
We certainly work to do so, Congressman, and we do so not just for our own retail products, but for third-party products as well.
Well,
and we
okay.
do work closely
Thank
with
you.
brands.
We've heard from numerous third-party sellers and brand owners that Amazon has used knockoffs as leverage to pressure sellers to do what Amazon wants. For example, the founder of PopSockets testified in January that Amazon itself was selling knockoffs of its product. After reporting the problem, it was only after his company committed to spending $2 million on advertisements that Amazon appears to have stopped diverting sales to these knockoffs. What is your explanation for that business practice?
That's unacceptable. If those are the facts, and that if someone somewhere inside Amazon said, buy X dollars in ads and then we'll help you with your counterfeit problem, that is unacceptable. And I will look into that and we'll get back to your office with that. What I can tell you is that we have a counterfeit crimes unit. We attempt to prosecute counterfeiters. I would encourage this body to pass stricter penalties for counterfeiters and to increase law enforcement resources to go after counterfeiters.
But your company does make money off of counterfeit goods being sold on your platform, isn't that correct?
If it does, in my view, sir, it would only be in the short term. We don't make. I would much rather lose a sale than lose a customer.
All right,
we make money because customers come back.
Fair enough, sir. Making companies pay extra to avoid having their products disappear in rankings seems to be so unfair, especially to small businesses. The American dream is threatened when that happens. Don't you think so?
Sir, I'm not exactly sure what you're referring to. If you're talking about what we were just talking about a second ago, I agree completely.
I'm talking about a totally different situation now, where a company that is selling on your platform but is not paying anything extra gets buried in the rankings, and but companies that pay extra are able to get their products pushed up and they avoid getting pushed down. Is that an acceptable practice?
Sir, I think what you're referring to is the fact that we offer an advertising service basically for third-party sellers to drive additional promotion to their products. That's a voluntary program. Some sellers use it, some don't. And it's been very effective at helping people promote their products.
With that, I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The committee will stand in a brief recess.
好，终于了我们的放到旁边，我们那个再来先讲一下我的 PPT 吧。现在是19:44。 19.44。好，今天的话我的那个正确率降低了就料到了开头，没有料到结尾啊。我们等会儿就预测一下回顾一下我们今天和这个周的预测，然后呢还有大麻大跌，然后广告收益到底变化了多少，还有今天就是美联储和国会听证会到底发生了什么，对吧？然后呢对，就按照这个记录来，对吧？先给大家看个东西啊，就是怎么说？作为就是庄家的话和市场就像这个海一样的，对吧？然后呢，你要做的，你能做的，你能挣钱的，只是就预测到这个 wave 什么时候过来，然后你提前做一个动作，对吧？就感觉好像你在做，但是呢，你是 cause 不了，我们作为小散户啊，是玩不了这些海浪的，我们只能预测，然后呢，能耍个酷，能挣点钱就顺便挣点钱，对吧？好。然后这就是today's call，我们说的，昨天呢说大麻热度会消失往下飘，然后呢科技板块高开为了下跌这个下跌这部分呢还是没有被证实，对吧？但我们就看明天怎么样呗，对吧？然后散户呢会看好10点半的石油数据，然后呢所以10点半之前都会表现较好，然后呢震荡，然后跌今天大势不看好向下，但是呢事实就是我们又被打脸了嘛，对吧？打脸是正常的，我们这种预测每日的就是10点之前确实是好的，然后呢10点半之前确实好的，然后呢接下来就是怎么说呢？有震荡，但是就是都是往上震的嘛，对吧？然后这边又是一个大的 sell off，但是呢马上就被拉起来了，所以这个到底是干嘛呢？怎么说？我有一个就是想法就是怎么说？他们会不会很多人都已经就是因为散户都是聪明的，对吧？我就基本上还是很多人都是聪明的，但是更多的人是挣不到钱的。那到最后，那这是为什么呢？因为就是很多人就提前跑，就是他们脑子是清醒的，但是呢，庄家会做一些让市场做的让市场变得不是 logical 的，所以把一些人给拉回来，这样的话他才能套住那些人，对吧？所以呢，现在我感觉会不会是就是很多人在听证会之前和他们财报发之前已经在避险了，所以呢，庄家觉得现在就往下砸有点太便宜很多人了，所以他要再把很多散户再拉进来。才能再往下砸，对吧？所以呢，这次他们就是每次下砸都拉上去，再下砸都拉上去了。然后有2种看法嘛，一种是你要是看牛的话，你就会觉得哇，每次下砸，不管是多坏的消息，它都能买上去，那说明什么？这个市场很强劲，对吧？那我们就买进去的，因为要做多的，它不会跌下来的。但还有一种，你要是看空的话呢，就可能觉得，哎，他们只是在诱多，因为怎么说呢？要真的反转这个地方压力很大，然后呢，接下来可能就是很容易就跌下去了。就是它的财报不管会不会像 Microsoft 一样的反应呢，对吧？还有呢，就是它今天的 Congressional hearing 到最后有什么最后结果呢，对吧？就得大家看一下了嘛，对吧？然后呢，然后对。就是所以呢，今天的话呢，我们就是我们的那个正确率就降低了嘛，因为我们原本是看跌的，就这边应该会跌下来的，3点半的时候，3点钟2点半的时候应该跌下来，但是没有，对吧？然后呢，就是今天 today's earning 波音、Aferia 和 AMD 都是AMD 特别好，对吧？然后呢，波音呢怎么说呢？我们也算是猜对了，因为它虽然不好，但是之前呢它就像之前我们看到什么公司一样，就有一个公司就是财报不好，但是它没跌，但是呢，大盘的时候它就开始拉下来了，对吧？所以波音就是很明显的，就是大家感觉，哎，大家感觉应该跌的呀，因为财报特别差呀，但是它就是没跌，然后就财报出来的时候就是没跌，然后呢，一开盘就狂跌了，对吧？就把很多人就是跌的，就是有点措手不及的那种感觉，对吧？然后呢，Feria 的话我们也说过嘛，就是很多人因为昨天前天2天的那个大麻的涨势他们就非常的看好大麻股市，觉得牛市要来了，大麻的牛市要来了。但是呢，对吧？就今天就是一大片红。我跟大家说过，你要买进大麻我是长期确实是看好的，但是我不建议你近期进，对吧？就是因为财报 organigram 报的非常不好，之前报过了。然后呢，现在 Aferia 应该也不会好到哪儿去，对吧？然后具体的我们在早上的时候已经说过了 对，然后呢，再看那个 Starbucks 也是Starbucks 还蛮好的，然后 GE 是不怎么好的 ，Shopify 特别好 ，Spotify 特别不好，对吧？然后呢，What the fuck 就是 Kodak 今天大家也看到了嘛，就多么疯狂，对吧？这是我这辈子看到最疯狂的一个股票啊，比 Terry 还要疯狂，对，就一下子就啪，然后上去，然后再啪下来，然后啪，然后再啪，对吧？啪啪一天啪啪好几次了。然后呢，如果你要建仓黄金白银的话，这2天确实有 consolidate 了，然后呢，你可以建小仓，对吧？因为大家都是对，就是你要是想建黄金的话，或者是白银的话，确实今天就是怎么说呢，它那个 graph 啊就已经有点怎么说呢consolidate 如果他们要再往上走的话，也是可能的嘛，对吧？像这些。但是唯一我不确定的就是大势要是真的跌下来的时候，黄金和白银到底会怎么样，对吧？然后要小心的呢，就是MGM 和 Win， 对吧？他们最近Win 也要快出了财报了，所以呢大家也要小心。然后还有那个就是重要信息，就是我开了一个网站的嘛，对吧？所以我就知道，就我用的是一个 Azoic 呢，是用 Google Exchange 的Google 的 Ad Exchange，它就是一个 third party 帮我connect 到 Google 的 Ad Exchange。然后呢，我其实还是用 Google 的广告的，所以我能看得到，基本上都就是他们的一个走势啊。然后呢，大家可以看到，这是2020年开始，这是2019年开始，对吧？一般来说呢，就是年初的时候都是蛮低的，对吧？January，然后 January 这边 January 也是暴跌嘛，因为那个 Christmas shopping Holiday shopping 季啊，就是广告费最高，然后下来了。然后呢，就出来一个，就是今天，然后3月份就来一个底嘛。然后现在很多财报呢，就是报的就是3月份到6月份的这个空间，就对吧？就广告费的话就在这个空间。所以呢，这边的话因为 close down 了，所以很多怎么说呢？确实是差不多你要就是本来是就是原本的话是 April 的话是在差不多他们都是在60到70这个地方，对吧？现在 April 的话，他们都是在40到50这个地方，对吧？这代表什么呢？就差不多差不多减了30%吧，对啊，减了30%的广告费，就是广告费确实还是有那个有影响的，但是呢，我们就要想想看，广告费跌了30%，但是还有广告的，所以广告费还是有的，但是呢，所以我们就要看广告它到底是就是大家在这些 APP 上或者 platform online 在网上它。花的时间有没有超过30%，对吧？所以就这样的话，有个地方除以一个乘以一个0.7，另一个地方如果乘以一个超过1.3，那有可能还是会就怎么说呢？这个 coefficient 就是就看到底是广告费减的那个地方减的那个幅度啊，能不能被大家花更多时间在网上这个幅度增长的幅度可以补掉，对吧？我们从 Snapchat 上次财报看到，确实是能补掉的，就是他们的广告费收益是增高了，对吧？所以呢，我不是太担心这个。关键亮点是什么？就是我们不会说，哎，这个今天表现很好，我们要买什么？我给大家提供的那个价值呢，就是我们以后预测东西，对吧？我们要预测未来，预测一个走势。预测的走势呢，就是大家就是接下来像 Google Snapchat、Twitter。他们跌多少，你必须得买，就是抄底，逢跌就买，因为接下来这个广告收益就是怎么说呢？把这边这个缺口就相当于这边就是这条线底下这个小缺口，然后这边白色的面积全部减掉，然后粘贴在了这边上面，对吧？因为这边的话 ，July 大家看July 的话，它就是怎么说呢 ？July 到 October 其实是他们这个是它现在差不多80到，就是差不多要接近 Christmas 季度了，对吧？因为 reopening 大家都想要拉点客嘛，对吧？所以呢，都是狂发广告的，对吧？而且这边也很多公司也停止了广告费，这样的话，他们下一个季度的 budget 就会多一点嘛，对吧？所以呢，下个季度广告业的公司你们都要就是好好的就抄底吧，找机会抄底。接下来的广告费公司，就 Google Twitter Snapchat 这些，他们都会很亮眼，对吧？Facebook 会很亮眼，Facebook 倒不知道，Facebook 它July不是 都是停掉了嘛，广告商，那就说明什么呢 ？Facebook 的广告商原本要在 Facebook 的广告商全部会加到别的平台上去，所以大家就记住，就不要投 Facebook， 但可以投 投 Google、Twitter 和 Snapchat， 他们的广告费会很亮眼，因为还是很多人不会回去工作，还是在天天就是天天在家里刷手机，还有很多人就是 work from home， 但是大家知道 work from home 是什么概念的？就是你要那个8小时的工作，你要拖到12个小时的，拖到睡前你可能还没完成的。所以呢，就为什么呢？就是因为你还在工作的时候会看看手机啊，什么刷就那个 procrastinate， 对吧？所以呢，使用率啊，用户的使用率还是会很高的。所以呢，然后现在使用率继续保持很高，然后呢，广告费又是相当于把上个季度缺的全部补在了这个季度，那说明什么呢？那就说明下个季度的广告收益会特别特别好，对吧？然后呢，大盘新闻 cyber attacks surge with massive shift to remote work， 对吧？所以呢，你们要是看到这个是什么意思呢？就是要看看我找出来的2个我觉得蛮好的就是 cyber security 的公司啊，就是一个 Cloudflare， 一个 CrowdStrike， 但是大家就现在都是蛮贵的，所以大家可以自己看看，就是什么时候如果要跌的时候，你可以看看买一点。Cloudflare 的话，说实话不贵，我倒建议是买的。这样吧，38我自己38.5，我自己在这边说吧。2020-07-29，对吧？net buy 38.5，这个我们就定下来，立个 flag， 对吧？然后呢，这个呢就是怎么说 ？The whole world is on Cloudflare， 就是他们就是 protect you against DDoS 啊什么的，对吧？然后我的网站都用 Cloudflare 的所以呢，就是怎么说呢？现在很多人要是在网上要做网店啊，做什么的话，开个网站啊什么的话，都会用 Cloudflare 来就是保护一下。对，然后呢，不是这个。然后今天的数据嘛，就是我们也说了 ，crude oil 很好，对吧？很亮眼。然后呢 ，pending home sale 也差不多，对，就没有这个倒是没什么太大意思。然后呢 ，coronavirus，这个 virus case surge， 对吧？但确实就是有点回来一点了。但关键是什么呢？有一个大的那个就是大的新闻啊，就是 record，死亡的 record。这是一个怎么说，有点不好的消息，会不会就是怎么说，会不会就影响恐慌呢？这个我们也得继续看的嘛，对吧？然后呢 ，5-year Treasury yield hits fresh record low， 就是说很多资金啊，就是不是一般人去买 Treasury yield 的，都是 seasonal investor， 对吧？像我们这种就是比较浮躁的investor， 我们都不会去想到要去买 Treasury 的，对吧？大的公司就是我们，而且对 Treasury。买 Treasury 对我们来说完全没有用，对吧？因为他们是干嘛用的呢？就是有很多钱的人啊，他们要 hedge 一下，然后他们要保护自己的钱，让他不会就是被对啊，就是保护他们很多的现金，所以呢，他们就会去 invest to bond 债券，对吧？然后呢，现在呢，就是 yield 越低呢，就说明它价格越高，对吧？所以你挣的钱就越低了，因为你的 yield 很低，你还有人买，对吧？所以需求量越大 ，yield 越低。对吧？然后呢，越低呢，就说明很多这些很大的资金啊，全部涌入了 Treasury yield 里面去了就是他们要找一个风险避点，所以这个呢是看空美股的一个信号，对吧？当然这个信号也已经很久了，所以我们都不知道这个信号到底什么时候到底真的会临现，对吧？然后呢，听证会一开始呢就是怎么说呢？就是意思就是说，其实啊就是就是他们不想让我们这些 consumer stuck with bad options， 对吧？很多时候，当这个一个市场只有一个选择的时候，你不管这个选择，就是他虐我千万遍，我待他4初恋，对不对？就是他们不想让我们这些消费者或者是小的那些商家，他们让我们感觉就是只能跟一个公司合作，对吧？所以他们就要有这个听证会，对吧？然后呢，这个听证会呢，就说你大不是错你应该还是被奖励的，但是呢，我们需要就是就是 basically protect our consumers and competition， 对不对？然后呢，头发稀疏 Jordan 开始发大炮，然后就他那个放炮一下子把那个拉到高潮，之前都很 nice 的一个开头，对吧？然后呢，每个人都在卖惨什么哦，就说自己啊，我家我妈是那个17岁的时候把我生下来，怎么就开始卖惨嘛，大家都在卖惨，对吧？先是5分钟，一开始大家给5分钟嘛，大家都在卖惨大会，然后呢再说他们创造的东西，老百姓有多么喜欢，然后他们小的 business 有多么喜欢，但是到最后都被打脸了嘛，对吧？听证会一开始开始以后，慢慢的证据都拿出来的时候，都就是脸啪啪啪啪的响，对吧？然后对，就一开始就是 feels like a stock pitch， 对吧？所以一开始股票一直慢慢的走高嘛，就因为他们说我们的公司多么好，然后客户多么喜欢我，然后怎么，对吧？然后呢，对，然后接下来就是 Fed hold，然后2点钟的时候，哎呦妈呀，又来一个信息，Fed 那个美联储那个就还是保持在0.25嘛，对吧？然后呢，他说就是还是就是之前用的那些东西啊，像那个dollar liquidity swap 和 repo operations，它会弄到就是原本是今年会结束的，他们会弄到明年的Q1， 对吧？所以这个又是把那个市场拉上去了，对吧？然后呢 ，the swap lines are established during the current， 对，就是让 US dollar 可以再流畅的通一点嘛，对吧？这个对，然后呢，这是他们改的一些东西，他们其实每次都发的是一样的东西，但是呢，每次都会改的改一点点，对吧？然后呢，就是说之前的是对就之前呢，他说的是 virus and measures taken to protect public health have induced sharp declines in economic activity， 然后呢，现在又是 following sharp declines in economic activity， 然后就是对但是还是主要是什么呢？还是 well below their levels at the beginning of the year， 对吧 ？Overall financial conditions have improved in recent months， 对吧？这就是稍微涨高了一点了嘛，对吧？但是呢，the path of economy will depend significantly on the course of virus， 就是说给看空也是来了一点就是来了点信心嘛，就是如果这个 virus 不好的话，这个 economy 还是不会好起来的，对吧？所以这个其实都是怎么说呢，都差不多嘛，每次都说话的差不多。然后呢，一年的然后回到那个 congressional hearing 国政听会就是一年的 investigation 还是真的是有点料的，就是各种各样的黑料都挖出来了，对吧？然后就现在从 Google 说，stealing content， 然后呢 criticizes 然后他们就说你这个 Google 这个 business model 不行。对吧？一堆谈政治跟我说，跟 Google 说教他的 Google 的 business model，然后呢 kills potential competition that causes loss of revenue and diverse traffic。就有的人他要是觉得有的公司就 Google 要是觉得有些页面导流太多了，他们就会怎么说呢？就是弄一下他们，对吧？就让大家在网上穿梭来穿梭去，最后还是回到 Google 的。然后呢 ，Yelp 呢，就比如说是很好的一个例子，就是 Yelp 也是放 review 的嘛，对吧 ？Google 就偷他们的 review， 然后呢 ，Yelp 就跟他们说抱怨了，然后 Google 就说，哎，你再抱怨的话，我都不让你上我们的那个 search engine 了，就是人家想找你都找不到，对吧？然后呢，对，就是差不多都是这样嘛，就是问个问题，然后呢 ，CEO 都牛头不对马嘴的回答，然后就一个 yes or no question， 他也要对，确实是有的地方确实不能用 yes or no 来概括，但是呢，怎么说呢？就是很多地方确实我感觉他们说话可能可以更加 straight to the point，unless they have something to hide， 对吧？有可能他们也要藏东西，对吧？然后我们最后看看，因为最后我都没有时间更新这个新闻，因为那个看的太投入了，真的太搞笑了那个国会，所以呢，at home source对 ，after announcing preliminary results，Facebook 应该是推迟到明天星期四以后，星期四那个，所以明天就是明天的那个市场关门以后，会有很多很多的大的消息出来，到底会是拉高呢，还是拉低呢，都不知道。然后对，就其实也没有什么太多的那个buy back on track for lowest， 就是但这个意思是什么呢？就是很多公司可能就没钱买回来自己的股票，但是呢，就是也可能是省钱，省着就是接下来他们照是真的买的时候，真的开始买的时候，又会把股票推上去了，对吧？然后 stick with stocks，对，就是 Bank of America 说你投资 bond， 你还不如投资 stock， 对吧？反正 反正就这些嘛，对吧？对，另外没什么了。我们看它回来了没有？还是 recess， 这个 recess 有点长。看一下。
No way of knowing.
哦，对吧？现在是39分。哦，对，先结束一下，然后明天是 GDP 很大的数字啊，负34.1，我倒觉得我感觉有可能是什么样的，就是它可能负20或者负30，比这个数字要小一点点，但是说出来这个以后，他们就是很多散户觉得，哎，比34要少，所以呢，他们就买进去了。但是买进去以后，大势再跌下来，这是为什么呢？就是他们就必须得制造一个反差，然后才能让散户觉得，哦，其实没有想象的那么差，然后买进去，然后呢，大盘才撤离，大庄家才撤离，让散户接在那个头顶，对吧？这可能是会一个，但也有可能是他们自己造出来的一个，就让 GDP。感觉很差，但是其实不那么差，然后再让这个市场再往上拉高，这也是可能的，对吧？所以其实我也怎么到时候再看吧，对吧？然后还有一个就是 initial job loss claim，上次是140多万，然后呢，现在到底是多少？可能会增长超过145万吗？这也不知道，对吧？但是我感觉应该是会慢慢的会往150、160万的人数增加的。然后明天的话就是有UPS，对，我们看 PayPal 的PayPal stock after hours， PayPal 是利好的一个。Anyways，就明天是 UPS、Mastercard、AstraZeneca、P&G，然后呢，大的就是盘后嘛，就是 Amazon、Apple， 然后 Facebook 移到这边来了，然后还有Alphabet， 对吧 ？Gilead 的话，我觉得应该是蛮好的，大家应该可以买的。我上次我有说嘛，对 Gilead 应该买的，就是因为怎么说，它可能哪怕财报不好，它也可以像一个 Johnson 和 Johnson 一样，或者是 Pfizer 一样，就说虽然财报没有达到预期，但是哎。我告诉你啊，我们接下来1年都是很好的呀，对吧？那就股票就拉上去，对吧？所以呢，就对Merck 的话也是，Merck 好像是如果它是我想象中的那个疫苗公司的话，应该也会好的，对。但哎，这些都别赌了，就是你好好的星期五 chill 一点好了，然后对。预测的话，明天的话是看空低开低走当然这几天我都会是看，接下来几天我都是可以看空，因为我感觉现在拉的话，怎么说没有太大的活力了，就是真正聪明的人已经埋伏在里面了，真正所以机构应该已经都埋伏在这里面，早就拉起来的之前就埋伏了，但是现在在干嘛呢？就是拉高就出货了，所以我到底这个真的走势是怎么样呢？我觉得还是应该是往低走，庄家才能挣到更多的钱。而现在他们只是想的就是拉多高才能把最后的就是很多散户大部分散户让他们投降，然后拉进去，对，然后所以预测低开低走，对吧？或者也是高开低走也可能的，对吧？然后现在是42分40秒。好，现在我们一起既然就是已经结束了，我们就一起来，就是大家想的话可以一起看这个。
How many sellers are inside that group, or what the breakdown would be between those sellers?
So,
and I would remind you that it's not that different from perhaps a bestseller list or a product ranking, which we do make public for all.
And I just want to be clear, does Amazon allow the use of aggregate data to inform private label Amazon brands when there are only 3 sellers for a product?
Yes, sir.
Does Amazon look at aggregate data when there are only 2 sellers of a product?
Yes, sir.
So, and am I correct in my understanding that Amazon is conducting an internal investigation on the use of third-party data?
Yes, we're basically trying to understand some of the anecdotes that we saw in the Wall Street Journal article.
Will you commit to informing this committee on the outcome of that investigation, including on the exact circumstances of when Amazon is allowed to view and/or use aggregate data?
Yes, we will do that.
And now I want to move, just really quick, music can be used to drive revenue, and obviously there's a reason it's important, and I want to talk about Twitch for a second. News reports have indicated that Twitch users are receiving notice and takedown requests pursuant to the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. My understanding is that Twitch allows users to stream music but does not license the music. Is that correct?
I'm going to have to ask that I could get back to your office with an answer to that question. I don't know.
Okay, and then, well, so that would be great. And then, so I just have two more questions related to that. If Twitch is responding to DMCA notice and takedown requirements, should Twitch consider proactively licensing music instead of retroactively adhering to those notices? So these are the questions we're interested in. I'm primarily concerned about small, up-and-coming musicians, different people that aren't necessarily labels, to make it as easy for them to at least get cease and desist notices out as well, and as we continue to move forward there.
Yes, Congressman, that's an important issue, and I understand it, and I will get back to your office on that.
All right. Earlier this year, Google announced plans to retire third-party cookies that websites attach to users' browsers, and this allows users to be tracked across the internet. A consequence of that change is that it will put other digital advertising market participants at a disadvantage because they can no longer track users. And at the very, very danger of being pro-cookie, because I'm not when I use my computer as well. And I understand that there are legitimate privacy concerns with third-party cookies, but I do want to focus on the competition aspect. Did this asset action also place Google at a disadvantage, or does Google have alternative means of collecting that user data to inform its digital advertising activities, Mr. Pichai?
Congressman, as you rightly pointed out, this is an area where we are focused on user privacy, and users clearly don't want to be tracked with third-party cookies. In fact, other browser vendors, including from Apple and Mozilla Foundation, have also implemented these changes. We are doing it thoughtfully, giving time for the industry to adapt, because we know publishers depend on revenue in this area. But it's an important change, and I think we have to be focused on privacy to drive the change forward.
But you have other ways of collecting that information, correct?
On our first-party services, we don't rely on cookies, and obviously when people come and type into search.
I'm not asking you if you rely on cookies. I'm asking you if you have other ways of collecting it through Gmail or consumer-facing platforms, right?
We don't use data from Gmail for ads, Congressman, but to the extent on the services where we provide ads, and if users have consented to ads personalization, yes, we do have data.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Demings, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Zuckerberg, during discussions of changing Facebook's platform policy in 2012, you said that, and I quote, "In any model, I'm assuming we enforce our policies against competitors much more strongly." It sounds like Facebook weaponizes its policies to target competitors. Why would Facebook enforce its policies against competitors more strongly?
Congresswoman, when we were a much smaller company, we saw that—
This is 2012 now. This was in 2012, so please go right ahead.
Sure. We've had policies in the past that have prevented our competitors, which at the time we were primarily worried about larger competitors, from using our platforms to grow and compete with us. So we had some of those policies. We continually review them over time, and
okay, Mr. Zuckerberg, in 2013, a senior Facebook employee identified MessageMe as a fast-growing app on Facebook and said that we will restrict their access. Was this another example of enforcing Facebook's policies against competitors much more strongly? MessageMe.
Congresswoman, I'm not familiar with that specific example, but we did have that policy.
Okay, let's move to another one and see if you remember this one. In 2014, other Facebook product managers openly discussed removing Pinterest's access to Facebook's platform tools. As one employee said, "I am 100% in favor of the idea of moving it from Pinterest, but I am not recommending removing it from Netflix going forward." Why would Facebook product managers want to restrict Pinterest's access to Facebook, but not Netflix?
Congresswoman, I'm not familiar with that exchange. I don't think I was on that.
Why do you think you wouldn't have to be on that, but why do you think they made that decision or would make a decision like that?
Well, Congresswoman, as I said, we used to have a policy that restricted competitors from using our platform, and Pinterest is a social competitor with us. It's one of the many competitors that allow people to share different types of
Mr.
content with their
Zuckerberg, these
communities.
examples and supporting documents strongly suggest that Facebook does weaponize its platform policies, enforcing them selectively to undermine competitors. But let's move on. Mr. Cook, I am concerned that Apple's policies are also picking winners and losers in the app economy, and that Apple rules mean Apple apps always win. Mr. Cook, in 2019, Apple removed from the Apple Store certain apps that help parents control their children's devices. Do you remember what justification Apple cited?
Yes, Congresswoman, I do. It was that the use of technology called MDM, mobile device management, placed kids' data at risk. And so we were worried about the safety of kids.
Okay, all right. So you were concerned about that the app basically undermined kids' privacy. But another app that used this same tool was Appshare, an app owned by the Saudi Arabian government. Do you recall what Apple's position was towards this app?
I'm not familiar with that app.
Okay, Apple allowed this Saudi app to remain. So there are two types of apps. They use the same tool. Apple kicks one out and said that that was one that was helping parents, but keeps the one owned by a powerful government. If that is correct, Mr. Cook, that apps that supposedly did the same thing, why would you keep the one owned by a powerful government?
I'd like to look into this and get back with your office.
It sounds like you applied different rules to the same apps.
We apply the rules to all developers evenly.
Did the fact that Apple had its own, Mr. Cook, let me just ask you this. Did the fact that Apple had its own parental control apps that were competing with these third-party apps contribute to Apple's decision to kick them off the Apple Store? Mr. Cook, what do you think about that?
It did not. There's over 30 parental controls on the App Store today. So there's plenty of competition in this area. And I would point out that this is not an area where Apple gets any revenue at all. We do this
Mr. Cook,
because
I didn't ask anything about revenue. That was not my question, but I'm out of time. And thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady for yielding back. And now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Jordan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would yield to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Zuckerberg, just as Mr. Pichai gave prior testimony to Congress saying there wasn't editorial manipulation on their platform, you have previously given testimony to the Congress saying that there is not editorial manipulation that disadvantages conservatives. And just like in the case of Google, there have been whistleblowers from Facebook that not only have offered evidence indicating your testimony was not truthful, but there's even video that suggests that content moderators that you employ are out there disadvantaging conservative content. I'm wondering if you are familiar with the experiences of Zach McElroy and Ryan Hartwig, two people who participated in Facebook content review, and what is your response to the very damning video evidence and the testimony from them that the culture that you lead within Facebook is one that disadvantages conservatives and leads to content manipulation?
So, Congressman, I'm somewhat familiar with the concerns that they've raised, and as I've said, we aim to be a platform for all ideas. We got into this because we want to give everyone a voice. I certainly do not want our platforms to be run in a way that has any ideological bias, and I want people to be able to discuss a range of issues. When people raise concerns like that, we do look into them to make sure that that everyone in our operation is behaving and upholding the standards that we would like. And if the behavior that they cited is true, then that would be unacceptable in our operation.
And following the release of those videos and that evidence from Project Veritas, will you then describe the investigation that Facebook undertook to root out these very corrosive effects on your platform?
Congressman, I'd have to get back to you with more details on that, but I know that we have ongoing training in what we do, and we certainly will look into any complaints that come up, and we want to make sure that in how we run the content review teams, that it's done in a way that reflects the values of the company around giving everyone a voice and being a platform for all ideas.
I'm concerned that the content review does reflect the values of the company, but those values don't in fact give everyone a voice. They prejudice against certain content. And while I appreciate training as a prophylactic endeavor to try to guide future content, it seems disingenuous for you to suggest that these videos come out that are very damning, that show the people that you trust with content moderation admitting on video that they disadvantage conservatives, that they label people who support the president as a way to push down their content and limit the reach of that content, for you to then come to us many months later after that was all over the news and the internet and say, well, you know, you'll get back to us and you do a little training. It seems to suggest that you don't take these allegations and this evidence very seriously. And so I'll ask the question perhaps in a different way. Would you revise your prior, in your prior testimony to Energy and Commerce, you said this does not happen, it cannot happen. Would you at least be willing to acknowledge, based on the irrefutable evidence before us that you don't seem to have investigated, that it is possible that at Facebook, your employees do have the power to disadvantage conservative viewpoints, and that they in fact have used that power in ways that we need to root out?
Congressman, my testimony in the past and today is about what our principles are as a company and what we try to do. Of course, when you have tens of thousands of employees, people make mistakes, people have some of their own goals some of the time, and it's our job in running the company to make sure that we minimize errors and that we make sure that the company's operations reflect the principles that we intend to run it on.
And when you fire people as a consequence of their politics, do you think that that impacts the culture and perhaps empowers some of the content moderators to also treat people worse as a consequence of their politics?
Congressman, I'm not sure what you're referring to, but I'm not aware of any case where we have fired someone on behalf of their politics, and I would say that that would be an inappropriate thing for us to do.
Why did you fire Palmer Luckey?
Congressman, I'm not sure it's appropriate to get into a specific personnel issue publicly.
I mean, I could just tell you that Palmer Luckey's NDA with you, I only have 10 seconds, but Palmer Luckey's NDA with you doesn't allow him to talk to anyone except government officials. I'm a government official. I've seen the messages where you have specifically directed Mr. Luckey to make statements regarding his politics for the benefit of your company. So I think both in the case of these content moderators and in the case of the testimony you just gave regarding Mr. Luckey and firing people over their politics, there is serious question as to whether or not you're giving truthful testimony here or whether it's lying before Congress. I see my time's expired and I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Pache, I wanted to focus a little bit on Google's acquisition of YouTube and some of the consequences of that move for consumer privacy and competition. Now, Google purchased YouTube in 2006 after identifying it as a potential rival that could eventually draw business away from Google. And it's my understanding Google paid $1.65 billion for that acquisition, nearly 30 times its original bid of $50 million. So could you tell us why Google was willing to pay so much more beyond the initial proposed bid? And was this as a result of any analysis on the harm Google would suffer if a competitor had purchased YouTube?
Congresswoman, we acquired YouTube in 2006, and this was well before my time there as CEO, and I wasn't directly involved. But what I do recall at the time is that we saw it as a new emerging area, and our mission is to help users with information. We saw an opportunity, and it wasn't clear. YouTube only had 67 people.
Okay, was Mr. Page in charge of that decision?
Congresswoman, I wasn't directly involved, but I'm pretty sure our senior leadership team at that time definitely looked into it.
Okay, I would encourage the subcommittee to take the steps necessary to have us hear from whoever was in charge of that. Moving on, Google is now by far the top online site where Americans watch videos, including children's videos. And as I'm sure you're aware, federal law prevents companies from collecting data on children under 13. However, just last year, the Federal Trade Commission found that Google had spent years knowingly collecting data on children under 13 on YouTube and offering advertisers the ability to target those children directly. Mr. Pache, did YouTube use the data it illegally acquired to improve its ability to target ads to children?
We are, this is an area, I take it very seriously. I'm a parent too. We are committed. We have invested tremendously. We have a dedicated product for kids in YouTube Kids. On the main YouTube platform, we make sure we have clear policies. We enforce them rigorously. Just in Q4 of 2019, we flagged and removed almost close to 1 million videos, potentially for concerns around child safety. So it's an area we are investing rigorously and will continue to do so.
Well, I'm more concerned about the fact that you're investing rigorously in luring in advertisers like toy makers, Mattel, and Hasbro by telling them that YouTube is the #1 website regularly visited by kids. So that sounds like you're targeting the kids and then targeting advertisers to bring them on board. Is that correct?
Today, in the main site of YouTube, we don't allow anyone under 13 to create accounts. There are scenarios in which there could be family viewing, and today there are creators who create content oriented towards families, and as part of that, there are advertisers which are interested in connecting with those users. But everything we do here, we obviously comply with all the applicable regulations. And
okay, well, let's look at some of the content that is specifically for children. COPPA makes it illegal to target those kids, but we've got an issue where content creators are in a very difficult position now. So if a show like Sesame Street doesn't want to show ads for junk food on YouTube, does YouTube allow it to make that choice?
Today, we do, we have choices both for creators in terms of, tools and preferences, and we have extensive tools for advertisers, and above all for users, we give a choice. They can either use YouTube as a subscription service without seeing those types of ads, or they can use it for free with ads. So we give choice, and for us, it is of utmost importance that YouTube is a place where people come to learn, and we find increasingly small and medium businesses use YouTube to thrive, especially even during COVID. Particularly met with many
Let's go back to content that's designed for children. So, if there's an organization like Sesame Street that wants to provide child-centered content, but they don't want that content to be sullied, shall we say, with junk food ads or something, my understanding is that you say that the content creators can do that, but we've got a recent report from the Wall Street Journal that says YouTube hasn't been honoring those requests. And it's been making it difficult for independent auditing companies like OpenSlate to independently audit that and then report back to those content creators about whether or not YouTube is honoring those. Is that correct?
I'm not familiar with the particular report, but I'm happy to understand it better and have my office follow up with your staff, Congressman.
I would appreciate that. My time has expired. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair would I recognize himself for 5 minutes. Mr. Bezos, thank you for being here today. In your opening statement, I reviewed your written testimony. You indicated, and I'll just quote, that Amazon accounts for less than 1% of the $25 trillion global retail market and less than 4% of retail in the U.S. End quote. When you refer to retail, I take it based on the empirical studies I've reviewed, you're referring to a broad definition of retail that includes restaurants, bars, gas stations. So it's a fairly all-encompassing view of retail. I wonder if you know what percentage of Amazon's sales are represented in terms of online retail sales, the e-commerce market stream.
The figures I've seen for, I don't, with all respect, I don't accept that e-commerce is a different market. but as a different channel, what I've seen is sort of 30 to 40% is the outside studies that I've seen where Amazon's share of that e-commerce channel.
And that's consistent with the data that I have seen. The latest figure I saw was 40%. And so in terms of how we define it, whether it's a stream or a channel, nonetheless, I do think that, just factually, it's important. It's an important distinction that I want to make sure we clear here. Obviously, I suspect you understand more than most that the early stages of a startup where entrepreneurs are undertaking risks to bring their products and services to market. Over the course of our investigation, we've heard directly from startups who rely on Amazon services, and that includes, obviously, Representative Jayapal's questions, Representative Buck, my colleague from Colorado, with respect to concerns about the way in which Amazon uses confidential information. But we've also heard that, not just with respect to the marketplace, but Amazon's cloud computing arm, AWS, the notion that that computing arm essentially identifies startups' best technologies and rolls out replica products and services. So, Mr. Bezos, does Amazon use confidential information that companies share via AWS to build competing services?
No, sir, not that I'm aware of. AWS does often, they do keep expanding their services. AWS started, 15 years ago. We invented this entire category.
Let me just clarify that, Mr. Bezos. I appreciate that. Sorry, I apologize for interrupting. But last week, one of Amazon's former engineers posted online that he and his team, quote, proactively identified growing businesses on AWS, that they built competing products, and that they targeted those products to the business's customers. And there's been public reporting on that strategy. So I guess I wonder if you can comment on that and how you would account for those statements.
Well, I think there may be categories, some databases of different kinds and so on, where we see that it's an important product for customers, and we make our own product offering in that arena. But it doesn't mean we stop servicing the other companies that are also making those products. We have competitors using AWS, and we work very hard to make them successful. Netflix is one example, Hulu is another, and so on.
I think the concern, Mr. Bezos, with respect, is that the pattern emerges across the different components in Amazon, whether it's the marketplace or whether it's the cloud service, as I mentioned. In addition, there was an article, I'm sure you're aware, in the Wall Street Journal regarding the Alexa Fund, that according to news reports, Amazon's venture capital fund, the Alexa Fund, had invested in a number of different companies. I believe you're familiar with the Alexa Fund investing, for example, in Defined Crowd Corp. Does that ring a bell?
No, sir, I'm afraid it doesn't.
Okay, well, I'll represent to you, according to the Wall Street Journal, and I'll just quote from them, when Amazon Incorporated's venture capital fund invested in Defined Crowd Corp, it gained access to the technology startup's finances and other confidential information. Nearly 4 years later, in April, Amazon's cloud computing unit launched an artificial intelligence product that does almost exactly what Defined Crowd does, said Defined Crowd founder and chief executive Daniel Braja. Does that refresh your recollection? Are you aware of those allegations?
I read that article, but I didn't remember that piece of it. I apologize for that. I don't know the specifics of that situation, and I would be happy to get back to your office with more information about that.
Well, I would appreciate, I certainly would welcome that, and to the extent that you all can follow up with the subcommittee with respect to this particular article and the different episodes that are referenced, both in terms of Defined Crowd Corp. There's also another company called Nucleus that you may be familiar with. The reason why I ask these questions, the reason why it matters, Mr. Bezos, to me, is that we are very concerned about this innovation kill zone that seems to be emerging. I represent Boulder and Fort Collins, two of the fastest growing and most innovative tech hubs in the country, and entrepreneurs and founders shared their stories with this committee during one of our field hearings, actually a field hearing that we held at the University of Colorado Law School just earlier this year. And they are extremely dependent on big technology firms, including in terms of investment and capital, yet they live in constant fear that the platforms could steal their core technologies or ideas, making it impossible to compete because of those existing advantages. So I see my time has expired, but we will certainly be following up with respect to the episodes that I referenced. With that, I would yield back. Gentleman's time has expired. And the gentlewoman from Georgia, Ms. Macbeth, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Cook, Facebook acquired WhatsApp in 2014, and at that time, Sheryl Sandberg told the board that the deal was critical for countering the App Store power of Apple and Google, who choke off Facebook's access to mobile devices. Was Sheryl Sandberg correct? Does Apple have the power to exclude apps from the App Store?
If you look at the history of this Congresswoman, we've increased the number of apps from 500 to 1.7 million. So there's a very wide gate for the App Store. And there's fierce competition for developers, and we want every app we can on the platform.
Okay, so, but Mr. Cook, then what you're saying is that Apple can exclude apps from the App Store. In fact, it has. In 2018, Apple introduced an app called Screen Time, which helps people limit the amount of time they or their kids spend on their iPhones. Is that correct?
It sounds right.
Okay, but before Screen Time existed, there were other apps in the App Store that gave parents control over their kids' phone usage, apps like Our Pact and Kids Locks, and parents depended on them. Soon after you introduced Screen Time, however, you removed these competing apps from the App Store. One mother wrote to Apple saying, and I quote her, "I am deeply disappointed that you have decided to remove this app and others like it, thereby reducing consumer access to much-needed services to keep children safe and protect their mental health and well-being." Mr. Cook, why did Apple remove competing apps right after you released Screen Time?
We were concerned, Congresswoman, about the privacy and security of kids. The technology that was being used at that time was called MDM, and it had the ability to sort of take over the kid's screen, and a third party could see it. And so we were worried about their safety.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate
Today
that.
we have...
I appreciate that, but the timing of the removal seems very coincidental. If Apple wasn't attempting to harm competitors in order to help its own app, why did Phil Schiller, who runs the App Store, promote the Screen Time app to customers who complained about the removal of rival parental control apps?
Congresswoman, I can't see this email. I'm sorry, my eyes are not good enough to read it. But I see Screen Time as just an alternative, that there are over 30 parental control apps that are in the App Store today. And so there's vibrant competition for parental controls out there.
Okay. Well, Mr. Cook, the fact is that Apple sidelined Screen Time's competition by keeping them out of the App Store. And while Apple claims these competitors weren't meeting Apple's privacy standards, these apps creators say that you admitted them back in 6 months later without requiring significant privacy changes. And, of course, 6 months is truly an eternity for small businesses to be shut down. Even worse, if all the while a larger competitor is actually taking away customers. And, you know, this is not the first time something like this seems to have happened, Mr. Cook. Let me give you another example, you know, of the harm that's been caused to your competitors. In 2010, Apple introduced an online bookstore called the iBookstore, where it offered ebooks. And the only major publisher that didn't agree to join iBookstore was Random House. Random House wanted to offer its own ebooks through its own apps and submitted their apps to be added to the App Store. Amidst continued negotiations between Apple and Random House, Senior VP Eddie Q said, and I'm quoting him, I'm quoting him when he said, it prevented an app from Random House from going live in the App Store. Q himself cited this app rejection as a factor in finally getting Random House to give in and join iBookstore. Mr. Cook, is it fair for Apple to use its power over the App Store to pressure a business to join Apple's own app?
I can't see the email, and so I don't know the context of it, but there are many reasons why an app might not initially go through the App Store gate, because it may not work properly. There may be other issues with it, so it's very difficult to see. What I would say, though, on a macro basis, the gate to the App Store is very wide. We have 1.7 million apps in it. It's become an economic miracle.
Okay.
with over $138 billion of commerce just in the United
Mr. Cook,
States.
I really, really appreciate that sentiment. But, you know, I want to say to you that Apple enjoys enormous power to control which apps can reach consumers. Even some of the largest companies in the country fear your power. Our evidence suggests that your company has used its power to harm your rivals and boost your own business. This is fundamentally unfair. It harms small businesses that rely on you to reach customers. It stifles the innovation that is the lifeblood of our economy. Ultimately, it reduces the competition and choices that are made available to consumers, and that is a great concern to all of us. And I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. That concludes that round. In light of the request of Mr. Gates for a third round, and because many of my colleagues would like to get more fulsome answers on a number of issues, we'll proceed to a final round, and my expectation is we will conclude within the hour. And I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Zuckerberg, we've seen the dominance of several of the companies appearing before us today, that it's not just harmful to our economy and competition, but it's harmful to the founding principles of our democracy. Facebook and Google are designed to keep users on their platforms whatever the cost. Because disinformation, propaganda, and hateful speech are good for engagement, they're good for business. But over 100 years ago, the Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. wrote, "The most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing panic." My first question is, Mr. Zuckerberg, do you agree with that principle, that there are limits to harmful and false speech, and that are particularly important when it comes to the health and safety of the public?
Congressman, I certainly do, and I actually think that our policies go further than just limiting those types of things.
Well, Mr. Zuckerberg, you have 1 billion users and almost 50,000 employees, and so you agree you have a responsibility to remove harmful lies from your platform, correct?
Congressman, I think we have a responsibility to limit the spread of content that's going to be harmful for people. And also, if you, I'd like to add that I do not believe that we have any incentive to have this content on our service. People don't like it.
Except that, Mr. Zuckerberg, with all due respect, except that it is often the most engaging. It's the most, it brings the most likes, or it brings the most activity, which of course produces great profit. So you do have an incentive. The more engagement there is, the more money you make on advertising. So let me ask you a question. Let me give you some specific examples that will illustrate my concerns. These are some of the top 10 most shared articles on Facebook in 2020. Trump suggests injection of disinfectant to beat coronavirus and clean the lungs. Coronavirus hype, biggest political hoax in history. U.S. hospitals getting paid more to label cause of death as coronavirus. During the greatest public health crisis of our lifetime, don't you agree that these articles viewed by millions on your platform will cost lives?
Congressman, with respect, we certainly have policies that prohibit false information about COVID that would lead to imminent harm. And we've been quite aggressive about taking that down, as some of the questioning from the other side of the aisle has shown so far.
Well, Mr. Zuckerberg,
I'm quite proud of our efforts here.
Well, with all due respect, the problem is Facebook is profiting off and amplifying disinformation that harms others because it's profitable. This isn't a speech issue. It's about Facebook's business model that prioritizes engagement in order to keep people on Facebook's platform to serve up more advertisements. So I'll ask you very specifically, what are you doing right now to protect people from demonstrably false claims related to this deadly pandemic?
Congressman, I'll certainly answer that, but I have to disagree with the assertion that you're making that this content is somehow helpful for our business. It is not what people want to see, and we rank our what we show in feed based on what is going to be the most meaningful to people and is going to create long-term satisfaction, not what's just going to get engagement or clicks today. That's a common misperception about the company.
If that's true, Mr. Zuckerberg, how do you explain that On Monday, the second most popular post on Facebook was a Breitbart video claiming that you don't need a mask and hydroxychloroquine is a cure for COVID. And in the first 5 hours after being posted on Facebook, it racked up 20 million views and over 100,000 comments before Facebook acted to remove it.
Well, Congressman, a lot of people shared that, and we did take it down because it violates our policies. We work with the
After
CDC
20 million
to figure
people
out.
saw it over the period of 5 hours. I mean, doesn't that suggest, Mr. Zuckerberg, that your platform is so big that even with the right policies in place, you can't contain deadly content?
Congressman, I don't think so. I think we have, on COVID misinformation in particular, a relatively good track record of fighting and taking down lots of false content, as well as putting up authoritative information. We have built a COVID information center
I understand
with
that.
authoritative information from health officials.
Thank you, Mr. Zuckerberg. I just have one more question for you.
2 billion people.
I appreciate that. Mr. Zuckerberg, if a television station runs a false political advertisement, they're held liable for that. Why should Facebook or any other platform be different? While you may not be a publisher, you're responsible maybe not for the first posting, but you then take that posting and you apply a set of algorithms that decide how you will disseminate that, which is a business decision, not a First Amendment decision. And it's hard to understand why Facebook shouldn't be responsible for those business decisions.
Congressman, in terms of political ads, we've modeled a lot of our policies off of the FCC guidelines on broadcasters and their requirements to run political ads equally from all different sides.
Well,
Cable
I
networks,
think this,
of course, have more.
yeah, I think these examples, unfortunately, Mr. Zuckerberg, are just the tip of the iceberg. It's not just about COVID. Facebook hosts or enables countless pages and ads that are dedicated to conspiracy theories and calls to violence, including content that led to the white supremacist rally in Charlottesville in 2017. And Facebook gets away with it because you're the only game in town. There's no competition forcing you to police your own platform. Allowing this misinformation to spread can lead to violence. And frankly, I believe it strikes at the very heart of American democracy. And with that, I now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Pichai, in 2016, there was an internal Google meeting. You attended that meeting along with Sergey Brin. A video of that meeting was leaked to Breitbart. And at the meeting, top Google executives, including Kent Walker, lamented Trump's victory. They compared Trump voters to extremists, and it was discussed that there was an intent to make the Trump win a blip in the populist movement in American history. Now, I know you've testified today in response to my questions and Mr. Jordan's questions that you don't intend this time to engage in electioneering on behalf of the former vice president, but given the video evidence of senior members of your team in your presence saying that they had the intent to make the Trump victory a blip, why should we believe that testimony today?
Congressman, we do not have a view on, we respect the democratic process. We are deeply committed to it. As a company, we take pride in the information we provide to help people participate in free elections. And we are deeply committed to it, as I said to Congressman Jordan as well.
Do you remember that meeting? 2016 that you attended?
Yes, I do. It was in the context of, through the election across both sides, there was a lot of opinions. And as you know, elections are kind of a polarizing moment generally in the country. And there was a lot of rhetoric about certain issues which were
I understand rhetoric. I guess the question is, when the senior members of your team in your presence said that they did have the intent to change the outcome in a subsequent election, and then since that moment in time where we've seen all of these conservative websites and conservative viewpoints censored, you can understand why people would be concerned. So after your employees and top executives said in your presence that they intended to make the Trump victory a blip, what action did you take as the CEO to protect and preserve the neutrality of your platform?
Congressman, no one had a view on, ever interfering with elections or so on. But what I can tell you is we've made it very clear about 2 years ago, we announced new community guidelines for within Google, clearly making it clear that employees obviously are free to have their political views, but none of that they shouldn't bring that as they work on any of our products. And if we found any evidence that people are using a political agenda to manipulate any of our content platforms, we would take strong enforcement action.
We have sort of a string of events here. We have the 2016 meeting where people demonstrated their intent to make changes to hurt the president. Then we have your testimony today that's a little different than your testimony from December, where you say people can manipulate blacklists. And then you have the outcome where sites like Breitbart and Gateway Pundit and others see that disparate treatment. So it really doesn't take Sherlock Holmes here to connect the dots and see what Google's doing. I'm going to move on with my final 90 seconds, Mr. Bezos. I am deeply moved by your personal story. I am not here accusing you as someone who would ever traffic in hate, but it seems you have empowered people who do. And I'm particularly talking about the Southern Poverty Law Center. The Southern Poverty Law Center, which you allow to dictate who can receive donations on your Amazon Smile platform, have said the Catholic Family News, Catholic Family Ministries, the Federation for American Immigration Reform, the American Family Association, the Family Research Council, the Jewish Defense League, and even Dr. Ben Carson are extremists and should be treated differently. Dr. Carson is on the cabinet and is one of the most renowned minds in America. I'm just wondering why you would place your confidence in a group that seems to be so out of step and seems to take mainstream Christian doctrine and label it as hate.
Sir, it's a good question. We have, for those of you who don't know what Amazon Smile is, it's a program that allows customers to designate a certain fraction of their purchases to go to charity that we then pay for. And they can select from any one of millions of charities. And we use the Southern Poverty Law Center data to say which charities are extremist organizations. We also use the U.S. Foreign Asset Office to do the same thing.
But
those
why?
two together.
Since they're calling the Catholics and these Jewish groups hateful groups, why would you trust them?
Sir, I'm going to acknowledge this is an imperfect system, and
no doubt.
I would love suggestions on better or additional sources.
My suggestion would be a divorce from the SPLC, and I see that I'm out of time, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the chair. Recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Facebook is dominant not just in the social media market, but also in its digital surveillance capabilities. In 2012, Facebook had several tools that allowed it to conduct digital surveillance, including trackers, Facebook's like button, Facebook login, and a series of application programming interfaces, or APIs. Mr. Zuckerberg, these tools provide Facebook with insights into its competitors' websites and apps. Isn't that correct? Yes or no?
Congressman, I think broadly the answer to what you're saying is yes.
Right.
We, every other company here, do market research to understand what people are finding valuable.
All right, okay, so you're going beyond the scope of my question. I appreciate that answer, though. Mr. Zuckerberg, a few days before Facebook acquired Instagram, a Facebook vice president emailed you suggesting ways to improve Facebook's, quote, competitive research, end quote. By building a custom model, Facebook could improve its understanding of its competitors and, quote, make more bold decisions on whether they are friends or foes, end quote. Mr. Zuckerberg, how does Facebook improve its competitive research to distinguish friends from foe?
Congressman, I'm not sure exactly what he was referring to in that email there, but he is one of the people involved in running our analytics organization, and I think it's natural that he would, as part of his responsibility, be focused on market research and understanding more there.
And certainly, isn't it true that Facebook, after that conversation, purchased the web analytics company Onevo in 2013 to give Facebook more capability to monitor its competitors?
Congressman, I think you have the timing correct. after we purchased Onavo as part of our broader market research capacity.
And that would give you the capability to monitor your competitors, correct?
Congressman, it gave aggregate analytics as to what people were using and what people were finding valuable. Sort of like the type of product you would get from Nielsen or ComScore, or some of these other third-party companies that provide similar data.
Well, Mr. Zuckerberg, that acquisition gave you non-public real-time data about engagement, usage, and how much time people spend on apps. And when it became public that Facebook was using Onavo to conduct digital surveillance, your company got kicked out of Apple's App Store. Isn't that true?
Congressman, I'm not sure I'd characterize it in that way. I think this was part of a broader
Onavo did get kicked out of the App Store. Isn't that true?
Congressman, I believe we took the app out after Apple changed their policies.
And it was because of the use of these surveillance tools.
Congressman, I'm not sure that the policy was worded that way. Or that that's exactly the right characterization of it. But
okay, well, let me ask you this question. Let me ask you this question. After Onavo was booted out of the App Store, you turned to other surveillance tools, such as Facebook Research app, correct?
Congressman, in general, yes, we do a broad variety of market research, as do
and also, isn't it true, Mr. Zuckerberg, that Facebook paid teenagers to sell their privacy by installing Facebook Research app?
Congressman, I'm not familiar with that, but I think it's a general practice to be able to that companies use to have different surveys and
Facebook
understand data from how people are using different products and what their preferences are.
Facebook Research app got thrown out of the App Store too. Isn't that true?
Congressman, I'm not familiar with that.
Okay, well, over nearly a decade, Mr. Zuckerberg, you led a sustained effort to surveil smaller competitors to benefit Facebook. These were steps taken to abuse data, to harm competitors, and to shield Facebook from competition. You tried one thing, and then you got caught, made some apologies, then you did it all over again. Isn't that true?
Congressman, I respectfully disagree with that characterization. I think every company engages in research to understand what their customers are enjoying so that they can learn and make their products better. And that's what we were trying to do. That's what our analytics team was doing. And I think in general, that allowed us to make our services better for people to be able to connect in a whole lot of different ways, which is our goal.
Did you use that capability to purchase WhatsApp?
Congressman, it was one of the signals that we had about WhatsApp's trajectory, but we didn't need it. Without that, it was pretty clear that WhatsApp was a great product. I already had a relationship with Jan Koum, the founder.
And it was a competitor.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stubbe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question for all four, yes or no answer. Do you believe that the Chinese government steals technology from U.S. companies? Start with Mr. Cook.
I don't know of specific cases where we have been stolen from by the government.
So you don't believe that the Chinese government's stealing technology from U.S. companies, or you're just saying that not from yours?
I'm saying I know of no case on ours where it occurred, which is I can only speak to firsthand knowledge.
Mr. Pichai, do you believe that the Chinese government steals technology from United States companies?
Congressman, I have no firsthand knowledge of any information stolen from Google in this regard.
Mr. Zuckerberg?
Congressman, I think it's well documented that the Chinese government steals technology from American companies.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Bezos? You're on mute.
Mr. Bezos, I believe you're on mute.
I'm sorry. I have heard many reports of that, and I haven't seen it personally, but I've heard many reports of it.
So of all the different products that Amazon carries, you haven't seen that in any of the companies that sell products on Amazon or your company yourself?
Oh, well, certainly there are knockoff products, if that's what you mean, and there are counterfeit products and all of that. But the Chinese, if the answer is the Chinese government stealing technology, that's the thing I've read reports of, but don't have personal experience with.
It's no secret that Europe increasingly seems to have an agenda of attacking large, successful U.S. tech companies. Yet Europe's approach to regulation in general, and antitrust in particular, seems to have been much less successful than America's approach. America is a remarkable nursery for innovation and entrepreneurship in pursuit of the American dream. As you all know from direct experience, this is a country where it's possible to start a company from a garage or a dorm room and experience tremendous success. Do you have any recommendations on how Congress can better protect U.S. firms and U.S. companies from aggression and government intervention abroad, not just in Europe, but in China as well? Anybody that would like to chime in, I'll open it up to any of you. None of you have any recommendations on how Congress can better protect U.S. companies like yourself? All right, well, now I'll yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Gates. Thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Zuckerberg, what is a digital land grab?
Congressman, I'm not sure what you're referring to.
Well, in the emails that your company produced to the committee, there's one from David Weiner in 2014 where he's describing under the mergers and acquisitions advice within the company that you need to engage in a land grab. And he says, I hate the word land grab, but I think that's the best convincing argument, and we should own that. And it goes on to describe a strategy wherein Facebook would spend 5 to 10% of its market cap each year to shore up its market position. Does that refresh your recollection?
Yes, Congressman, thanks for the opportunity to address this and frankly, to correct the record, because I believe that what he was referring to was a question that was incoming from investors about whether we would continue to acquire different companies. I don't think that wasn't referring to an internal strategy. It was referring to an external question that we were facing about how we would how investors should expect us to act going forward. And I think he was discussing the fact that as mobile phones were growing in popularity, there were a lot of new ways that people could connect and communicate that were part of this overall broader space and market around human connection and helping people stay connected and share their experiences.
Okay, well, Mr. Zuckerberg, it seems to be both internal and external, because then in an email from you in 2012, we see a similar sentiment expressed. You write, we can likely always just buy any competitive startups. So is your desire to limit competition by purchasing your competitors consistent with the message to your investors that the way you'll run your company is through digital land grabs?
Congressman, I'm not sure I agree with the characterization of how we communicated with investors. But
your words, Mr. Zuckerberg.
But I think the broader point is that there were a lot of new ways that people can connect that were created by smartphones.
But this is about your merger and acquisition strategy. You went on to say one thing about startups is you can often acquire them. So, I mean, I'm not interested in how people connect. I'm interested in how you acquire businesses to limit competition.
The gentleman's time has expired, but the witness may answer the question.
Congressman, in order to serve people better and help people connect in all the ways they would want, we innovated and built a lot of new use cases internally, and we acquired others. And that, I think, has been a very successful strategy at serving people well. And a lot of the companies that we've been able to acquire have gone on to reach and help connect many more people than they would have been able to on their own.
You've grabbed a lot of land. I would say I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the chair of the full committee, Mr. Nadler, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cook, we've heard from businesses that Apple is canvassing the App Store to determine whether it can extract commissions from apps that have changed their business models in response to the pandemic. Businesses that relied on in-person interactions have moved online, and Apple is looking for its cut. Our staff has heard from some of the affected businesses. They say you're calling them up, demanding your 30%. Isn't this pandemic profiteering?
We would never do that, Mr. Chairman. The pandemic is a tragedy, and it's hurting Americans and many people from all around the world, and we would never take advantage of that. I believe the cases that you're talking about are cases where something has moved to a digital service, which technically does need to go through our commission model. But in both of the cases that I'm aware of, we are working with the developers. To sort of zoom out and to give you some historical context on this, when we entered the App Store market, the cost of distributing software was 50 to 70%. And so we took the rate in half and to 30%, and we've held it in that same level over time or lowered it. It's now responsible for 2 million jobs across America, and 84% of the apps on the store are distributed for free, where 100% of the proceeds go to the developer. Only that 16% is subject to a commission of either 15 or 30%.
And school is about to start around the country, and millions of parents and students will attend school online. They will rely on apps to talk to teachers, tutors, and virtual learning tools. Are these online learning tools next on Apple's, are they on Apple's list to monetize?
They're not, Mr. Chairman. We're very proud of what we've done in education. We are serving that market in a significant way, including tons of donations. And we will work with the people that happen to move from a physical to a virtual world because of the pandemic. And we've done a lot to address COVID in general as a company. We've sourced and donated 30 million masks, turning our supply chain into something that would be great for America. We've designed a face shield, donated 10 million of those. We're donating significant amount of money across the U.S.
Thank you. Thank you. Now,
thank you.
We've heard that Apple is now trying to extract commissions from various apps that previously didn't pay you anything. You approved, we're told, the email app Hey, and then days later threatened to kick it out of the App Store unless it built a way to give you a cut of revenue. The COO of Basecamp, maker of the Hey app, testified before our committee earlier this year. He was concerned about Apple's monopoly over software distribution on iOS devices. And he seems to have been right. Apple says services like Hey have always been required to cut Apple in, but you previously didn't interpret your rules that way. You didn't enforce your rules this way. So would you comment on this, please?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I would. Hey is in the store today, and we're happy that they're there. I believe that they have a version of their product is for free, and so they're not paying anything on that. I would also say the 30%, I hope you give me a time to explain this, or 15% is for lots of different services, from programming languages to compilers to 150,000 APIs. It has been an economic miracle to allow the person in their basement to start a company, a global company, and serve 175 countries in the world. It is amazing. Likely the highest job creator in the last decade.
I see. And you haven't changed the rules in such a way as to make apps pay when they weren't paying before.
I know of no case where we've done that. I'm sure we've made errors before. We get 100,000 different apps submitted a week, and we've got 1.7 million on the store. But across that period of time, we've never raised commissions from the first day the App Store went into effect back in 2008. We've only lowered them.
Well, thank you. I see my time has expired. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
Thank you for the question.
I now recognize the gentleman from North Dakota, Mr. Armstrong.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Pichai, in 2015, Google announced that it would not allow third parties to buy YouTube ads via AdX. That means that ad buys on YouTube are conducted only through Google demand-side products. Google justified this change by citing privacy and user experience. My understanding is that Google cited a concern that third-party digital ad participants would develop user profiles based on this viewing. It is also my understanding that even under the GDPR, you allow users to provide consent, which would authorize this type of activity. It seems that this policy, regardless of the privacy concerns, reduced competition for demand-side platforms on YouTube. Do you agree?
Congressman, we're always looking to improve the YouTube experience. Part of being able to integrate this way is why in YouTube we've been able to innovate with something called TrueView ads. So for users, we give them skippable ads. If they find the ads not to be relevant, they can skip past those ads. And monetizing YouTube well is what allows. Today we have many, literally hundreds of thousands of creators earning a livelihood, and many of them are small and medium businesses.
Yep.
So we want to support that well, and so we are focused on that. Allowing this type of integration is what allows us to create that user experience.
But after Google stopped allowing third parties to buy YouTube ads via AdX, Google limited the interoperability of third-party analytics on YouTube. You now require the use of ads on Data Hub. Again, the justification is based on user privacy. Other ad market participants may not have access to that data, but it doesn't disappear, does it?
Congressman, this is consistent with how today many services, be it Facebook or Snapchat or Pinterest, you work with their ad tools to buy ads on their properties.
Well, I understand that, but the excuse is privacy, but the data doesn't disappear. You just have greater control over it, right?
Congressman, it's a service we provide to our users. We obviously want to make sure we protect the privacy of users there. We do monetize with ads. We give users a choice of either consuming it as a subscription service or using it with ads. And we've been very focused on making YouTube a great platform for creators. And I think the model is working well. And it's really helped many small and medium businesses to invest on the platform and grow their businesses.
So you, regardless of the intent was to lessen competition or not, the action resulted in smaller competitors unable to participate in placing ads on YouTube. Isn't that correct?
Congressman, we see robust choice for advertisers. There is several alternatives. There is obviously Facebook suite of products. There is Amazon with their ads marketplace. There is companies like Snapchat, Pinterest, Twitter. There are new competitors who have emerged, and this is why we have seen advertising costs decline by 40% in the last 10 years. And so we see dynamism in the marketplace. We are focused on it.
Yeah, but here's my issue, and there are policies that actually protect user privacy. Apple's encryption policy. Microsoft just came out on facial recognition policy. My concern is that is that when we're using privacy, we're trying to use privacy and we're using privacy as a shield, but what we're really doing and what your company is really doing is using it as a cudgel to beat down the competition. And when we're talking about privacy, it's a great word that people care about, but not when it's utilized to control more of the marketplace and squeeze out smaller competitors. And with that, I'd yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Gates.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Bezos, we were cut short in our last discussion. I just wanted to give you the chance to clear this up. You don't believe Dr. Ben Carson is an extremist, do you?
No, sir, I don't.
So help me understand why you would partner with a group that labels him as someone worthy of an extremist watch list.
Well, I want you to hopefully appreciate when we're trying to make it possible for people to donate to any number from millions of different charities. And we need to have some source of data to use. And while I accept what you're saying, that the Southern Poverty Law Center and the U.S. Foreign Asset Office are not perfect, and I would like a better source if we could get it, that is what we use today.
Well, that's breaking news. It's great to hear that you do recognize the infirmities in the Southern Poverty Law Center, and there are, I guess, Mr. Zuckerberg and Mr. Pichai's companies use them as well. Mr. Zuckerberg, do you believe that Dr. Ben Carson is an extremist?
No, Congressman.
And so why would you trust the people who think he is?
Congressman, I'm not aware of where we work with the organization that you're saying.
Oh, the
Gentleman's
lawsuit.
time has
Okay.
expired.
That's
I now
helpful.
recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I read Richard Hofstadter's The Paranoid Style in American Politics, so I suppose it's futile to try to cure the obsessive persecution complex and victimology of some of our colleagues, but they should check out the top performing Facebook link posts by the United States pages today or yesterday or any day for the last week, and 7 or 8 out of the 10 each day are right-wing sites: Ben Shapiro, Fox News, Dan Bongino, Ben Shapiro, Fox News, Blue Lives Matter, and so on. So if Facebook is out there trying to repress conservative speech, they're doing a terrible job at it. And so I don't understand just the endless whining about how Facebook and Twitter are somehow discriminating against conservatives. The removal of Donald Trump and Donald Trump Jr. From Twitter, their tweets, was all about their spreading disinformation, false statements about COVID-19. That was an absolute public health measure, which I hope all of us would endorse. We don't want anybody, including the President of the United States, spreading false information about COVID-19. So I think they essentially destroy their own case when they pick that as their cause for going after all of you. And I don't understand for the life of me the line of questioning about electioneering taking place by some of your companies. If you're opposed to electioneering by corporations, as I am, and you're opposed to Citizens United, then you've got no problem. Citizens United is what gave corporations the power to go out and spend money. And if you don't like the way that some companies are spending money, then either start your own company or tell them what's wrong with it. But the idea that electioneering is something you're opposed to just strikes me as completely inconsistent with the history and the facts. So I want to go to Mr. Cook, if we could. But first, a quick question. Are any of your companies benefit corporations, and is that something you've considered doing? Is there any one of you that have thought about becoming a B Corp or a benefit corporation? Okay, I take it the answer is no there. Mr. Cook, I'm hung up on this whole 30% question that several members have talked to you about, and you said sometimes it's 15%, sometimes it's 30%. Can you explain when it's 15 and when it's 30 and why it's 15 sometimes and why it's 30?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Congressman. In 84% of the time, it's 0. 16% of the time, it's 15 or 30. In the case of it's 15 if it's in the second year of a subscription.
Okay, so you just graduate from your first year, you're taking no toll, essentially. The second year, it's 15, and then it's 30 after that. Is that right?
No. If it's a subscription product, it's 30% in the first year, and then it drops to 15 in the second year and every year thereafter.
I gotcha. Okay. Well, what troubles me is just what one businesswoman told me when I was looking at this, which is she said, I pay around 25% of my income to Uncle Sam, to the government, and then I pay 30% of my income to Apple, and so I get half of it, and it's very hard to make ends meet. And I just wonder, look, all of you are in business and all of you are tremendously successful at what you do, and obviously this model has worked for you. But the question is, does this model actually squeeze out the next generation of entrepreneurs? And is it an unjust arrangement because you're, the 10,000-pound gorilla and they're just trying to get started?
No, I don't think so. In fact, keep in mind, we've gone from 500 apps to 1.7 million. And so there's a lot of apps on the store, and a lot of people are making a very good living from it.
And you've said that, forgive me for interrupting, but you've said that several times. But that, to me, might just underscore the monopoly nature of your business, that everybody's got to go through you. There's really no alternative. And so, I don't blame you for taking them all, but that doesn't mean that the terms that are being dictated are in fact fair terms. So how would you defend substantively that bargain?
that whether you look at it from a customer point of view or a developer point of view, there are enormous choices out there. If you're a developer, you can write for Android, you can write for Windows, you can write for Xbox or PlayStation. If you're a customer and you don't like the setup, the curated experience of the App Store, you can buy a Samsung.
Okay, I appreciate that. Forgive me for cutting you off. I've got one more final question for Mr. Zuckerberg. You spend a lot of your time speaking to our conservative colleagues who have this persecution complex that you're somehow going after them. Will you have time to meet with this broad coalition of civil rights groups that are engaged in a boycott because of what they think is the proliferation of hate speech and Holocaust revisionism and other affiliated topics on Facebook?
Congressman, yes, I already have taken the time to meet with them. I think that the topics that they're pushing on are important. On a lot of the goals, we agree. These are issues around fighting hate that we have focused on for years, and we are committed to continuing to improve the way that our company works and just continually getting better on these issues.
I appreciate that, and I will tell them of your answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zuckerberg. I now recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cook, is the cancel culture mob dangerous?
It's something I'm not all the way up to speed on, but if you're talking about where somebody with a different point of view talks and they're canceled, I don't think that's good. I think it's good for people to hear different points of view and decide for themselves.
Yeah, I agree with that. I want to just reference a letter. Barry Weiss, who resigned as an editor at the New York Times, she wrote a letter explaining why she resigned. And I'll just read 3 sentences for all of you, actually. She says, first of all, my own forays into wrongthink made me the subject of constant bullying by my colleagues who disagree with my views. She then says later in the letter, everyone lives in fear of the digital Thunderdome. The online venom is excused so long as it is directed at the proper targets. And those targets aren't just conservative. In fact, Ms. Weiss is actually center-left. She's not conservative. The targets are anyone who disagrees with the mob. Are the rest of you concerned about the cancel culture mob and what it's up to? Mr. Pichai?
Congressman, I'm sorry, I had momentary difficulty hearing. But, you know, we've built platforms which allow for freedom of expression. And we take pride in the fact that across our platforms, including YouTube, there are more diverse voices than ever before. It is something we have committed to.
I'm just saying, I'm concerned about it. And again, I'm concerned about it not just because conservatives get attacked. I'm concerned when anyone gets attacked for expressing a viewpoint. I thought we had a First Amendment, and yet they constantly get attacked. How about you, Mr. Zuckerberg?
Yes, Congressman, I believe strongly in free expression. Giving people a voice is an important part of what our services do. And I'm very worried about some of the forces of illiberalism that I see in this country that are pushing against free expression. I think that this is one of the fundamental democratic traditions that we have in our country. And it's how we make progress over the long term on a number of issues. And our company is committed to doing what we can to protect people's voice.
Thank you, Mr. Zuckerberg. Mr. Bezos?
Yes, sir. I am concerned in general about that. And what I find a little discouraging is that it appears to me that social media is a nuanced destruction machine. And I don't think that's helpful for a democracy.
You agree with the term she used, Ms. Weiss used, digital Thunderdome?
I see that, yes.
Yeah, I see it too. And I guess my point is you were 4 pretty important guys leading 4 of the most important companies on the planet, and it would sure be helpful if you spoke out against this. I mean, Mr. Cook, there was a 1984 Super Bowl ad in black and white, had this Big Brother type figure as the narrator saying over the screen to a bunch of these workers, looks like it was straight out of the Soviet Union, saying to a bunch of these workers as they're sort of marching along, he says one of the lines that the narrator uses is, our unification of thoughts is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on the earth. And then the ad ends with this lady running in color and smashing the screen. busting the groupthink, busting the mob think. Do you remember that ad, Mr. Cook? What company had that ad?
I remember it very well. It was Apple versus IBM at the time.
Yeah, but the point was mob think, cancel culture, groupthink is not what this country is about. And we are seeing it play out every single, just take the sports world, for goodness sake. In the last few weeks, Drew Brees had to bow to the mob simply because he suggested you should stand for the anthem. There was a football coach at Oklahoma State who wore the, quote, wrong t-shirt fishing with his boys. He got in all kinds of trouble. James Harden wears a mask saying, back the police, help the police, support the police. He gets attacked. Why don't we just let the First Amendment work? That's all we're asking. And you are 4 individuals who have so much influence. It would sure help if you're out there criticizing what the cancel culture mob is doing to this country. And people see it every single day. And I hope you'll do it. I hope you all said you disagree with it. I hope you'll really speak out against it and be fair with all viewpoints. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I recognize the gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Jayapal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Pichai, I direct my questions to you. Many of us feel a deep urgency to protect independent journalism, and I wanted to talk a little bit about ad revenue and independent journalism. Google makes most of its revenue through selling advertising, and Google's advertising exchange is a, quote, real-time marketplace to buy and sell display advertising space, correct?
Yes, Congressman, that's correct.
And over 2 million websites, including online newspapers, use that exchange, correct?
We are very proud to support publishers, and I don't have the exact numbers, but yes, that seems to.
Well, that's an estimate put forth by tech expert Dina Srinivasan, and your own website for Google Display Network says you have access to over 2 million sites. What is Google's share of the ad exchange market?
Congressman, I'm not exactly familiar. I've seen various reports, but we are a popular choice.
Great. Let me put it up for you. If you look at the screen, you will see that 50 to 60%, Google has 50 to 60% according to the Online Platforms and Digital Advertising CMA market study that was just released. And in order to buy and sell on these exchanges, websites and advertisers go through a middleman like Google's DV360 and Google Ads. If you look at the slide, Mr. Pichai, you can see that the share of this buy-side market that Google has is 50 to 90%, according to the same study. And I just want to simplify how these exchanges work. So, say in Seattle, Dee's Electronics, a mom-and-pop business, wants to buy online ad space in the Seattle Times. Dee's Electronics would need to go to a middleman, like Google Ads, which would then bid for ad space on an ad exchange. The problem is that Google controls all of these entities. So it's running the marketplace, it's acting on the buy side, and it's acting on the sell side at the same time, which is a major conflict of interest. It allows you to set rates very low as a buyer of ad space from newspapers, depriving them of their ad revenue, and then also to sell high to small businesses who are very dependent on advertising on your platform. It sounds a bit like a stock market. Except, unlike a stock market, there's no regulation on your ad exchange market. If there were regulation, it would actually prohibit insider trading, which means that the broker can't use the data in the broker division to buy and sell for their own interests. Instead, brokers have to serve their clients. Does Google have a similar obligation to serve its clients, the businesses that are selling and buying ad space?
Congresswoman, if I could explain this for a minute, we paid over $14 billion to publishers. We're deeply committed to journalism in this area. On an average, we pay out 69% of the revenue when publishers use Google's buy and sell side tools. And it's a low margin business for us. We do it because we want to help support publishers in this area.
I understand that, Mr. Pichai. What I'm trying to get at is when any company controls the buy and the sell side, I worked on Wall Street a very long time ago, there are reasons that insider trading is regulated, and this ad exchange is essentially the same thing And without accountability, it isn't meaningful to just care about the newspapers. We're seeing them die all over, and ad revenue is a big reason. Let me put up a graph here that shows that Google's ad revenue is increasingly coming from ads on Google-owned sites and less so from other websites. Can you explain that trend?
I can't quite see whether this is net revenue or gross revenue. Obviously, when it comes to non-Google properties, we share the majority of revenue back to publishers, whereas on our own properties, we obviously, we have the inventory. So, but I would need to understand more. I just quickly looked at it. I'm not sure if
we can send it. We can send it to you and make sure you have it. Google has not made its search traffic volumes public in years, so there's no way for us to know exactly what's happening here, and there's no way for businesses to verify whether they've been treated fairly or left behind in favor of Google-owned companies. Is Google steering advertising revenue to Google search?
Congresswoman, users come to Google search. It is that traffic, and that's where our source of revenue comes from. So we are focused on providing users the information they are looking for. We work hard to earn their trust. We know competition for information is just a click away.
Thank you, Mr. Pichai. I just want to make the point that independent journalism is incredibly necessary to our democracy, and we want to do what we can to protect it. I want to just ask one last question of Mr. Zuckerberg. Over 1,100 companies and organizations pulled their advertising business from Facebook as part of the Stop Hate for Profit campaign to protest the spread of hate speech and disinformation. But you had a staff meeting earlier this month where you told employees we're not going to change our policies or approach because of a threat to any % of our revenue. My guess is all these advertisers will be back on the platform soon enough. Mr. Zuckerberg, are you so big that you don't care how you're impacted by a major boycott of 1,100 advertisers?
No, Congresswoman, of course we care, but we're also not going to set our content policies because of advertisers. I think that would be the wrong thing for us to do. We've cared about issues like fighting hate speech for a long time, and we've invested billions of dollars. And I've talked about today how we have tens of thousands of content reviewers. We've built AI systems that proactively identify the majority. We're now at 89% of the hate speech that we removed before anyone even reports it to us. We're going to continue getting better at that. And I think that those investments over time and the results that we put up will be recognized by people, since I do believe that they are industry leading. And I think that our advertising also is, for a lot of small businesses, the most effective or among the most effective ways that they can find and reach new customers.
Thank you, Mr. Zuckerberg. My time has expired, but I would just say that I know you've commissioned your own civil rights audit. I don't think that you've implemented all those recommendations yet. I hope you will move quickly to implement those. This is a critical time as we watched the body of John Lewis leave us here in the Capitol, that we focus on civil rights. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Before I call on the next witness, I want to recognize Mr. Pichai, who I think wants to make a correction for the hearing.
The only correction, thanks, Mr. Chairman. There was a question earlier about information with respect to China. I just wanted to acknowledge on record that I recalled in 2009, we had a well-publicized cyber attack originating there, which did exfiltrate some code from there. I just wanted to correct that on record.
Thank you, Mr. Pichai. The record will so reflect. I recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In March 2020, Amazon announced that it was going to start delaying shipments of non-essential products in order to better serve customers and meet need while helping to ensure the safety of their warehouse workers. In practice, however, it appears that this policy was applied selectively, as Amazon appeared to continue to designate its own products as essential, even as it delayed competing products from third-party sellers. So the essential items were supposed to include household staples, medical supplies, high-demand products, and that many factors were considered when determining eligibility to be essential. But we've had several employees report that Amazon continued to ship non-essential items like hammocks, fish tanks, pool floaties, et cetera. Mr. Bezos, were Amazon devices like Fire TV, Echo speakers, and Ring doorbell designated as essential during the pandemic?
I don't know the answer to that question. What I can tell you is that we had, there was no playbook for this. We moved very quickly. Demand went through the roof. It was like having a holiday selling season, but in March, and we had to make a lot of decisions very rapidly. Okay. Our goal was to limit it to essential supplies, but I'm sure we did not do that perfectly.
Okay. I know the Ring doorbell has 2 competing products, including Arlo and Eufy, maybe. Do you know if they were designated as essential?
I do not.
Okay. Are you able to testify to Congress today whether Amazon's profit factor was a factor in giving an essential classification distinction?
No, not to my knowledge. We were working to achieve 2 objectives. One was to get essential products to customers, and the second was to keep our frontline employees safe. And we did a tremendous amount of work in both categories, and that's what we were focused on. We were not focused on profitability at that time.
Pushing out the elusive Clorox wipe, I guess. But at any rate, moving along, let's talk about the fees that Amazon charges sellers. According to a recent report, seller fees netted Amazon almost $60 billion in 2019, nearly double the $35 billion in revenue from AWS, Amazon's massive cloud computing division. 5 years ago, Amazon took an average of 19% of each sale made by a third party on its site. Today, Amazon keeps an average of 30%. Doesn't Amazon's ability to hike those fees so steeply suggest that Amazon enjoys market power over those sellers?
No, Congresswoman, I don't believe so. I think what you're seeing there when you see that go from 19 to 30% is that more and more sellers are taking advantage of the incremental services that we offer. And a big piece of that is fulfillment by Amazon, which is probably the greatest invention that we ever created for sellers. And it's working for sellers. That's why today 60% of sales are going through third-party sellers, up from 0 20 years ago.
Right, but I think a little more concerning is the 11% hike. Since 2014, Amazon's revenue from seller fees has grown almost twice as fast as its overall sales. So seller fees now account for 21% of Amazon's total revenue. Mr. Bezos, aren't seller fees now effectively subsidizing Amazon's retail division?
Congresswoman, no, I don't believe so. I think what you're seeing there, when you see these fees going up, what's really happening is that sellers are choosing to use more of our services that we make available. They are, previously perhaps they were shipping their own products from their own fulfillment centers, so they would have had costs doing that. You're operating your own fulfillment center and buying transportation services to the customer through the Postal Service or through UPS or whoever it would be.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the fulfillment
centers.
With
fulfillment by Amazon.
Right,
yes,
okay,
please,
so we've got fulfillment by Amazon, and a year ago we asked whether a merchant who was enrolled in fulfillment by Amazon, also known as FBA, is a factor in whether they can be awarded the buy box, and at that time Amazon said no. But the evidence is indicating, and your own documents showing, that being enrolled in that program is a major factor, and it effectively forces sellers to pay for fulfillment services from Amazon if they want to make sales. Mr. Bezos, has Amazon's big buy box algorithm ever favored third-party sellers who buy fulfillment services from Amazon over other sellers?
I think effectively the buy box, maybe directly or indirectly, I'm not sure if it's direct, but indirectly I think the buy box does favor products that can be shipped with Prime. So especially if you're a Prime member, the buy box is trying to pick the offer. If we have multiple offers from multiple sellers for the same item, customer wants to buy that item. The buy box is trying to pick the offer that we predict the customer would most like. That includes price, delivery speed, and if you're a Prime member, it includes whether the item is eligible for Prime.
Thank you, Mr. Bezos. I think my time's expired.
Okay, time has expired. Before I recognize our last 2 colleagues, I think Mr. Zuckerberg would like to clarify something for the record as well.
Chairman, thank you. In response to Congressman Johnson's question before, I said that I wasn't familiar with the Facebook research app. When I wasn't familiar with that name for it, but I just want to be clear that I do recall that we used an app for research, and it has since been discontinued, and I would be happy to follow up with his staff on any more details that he would like on that.
Thank you, Mr. Zucker. The record shall so reflect. I recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Neguse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. Cook. I wanted to direct a few questions to you and wanted to talk a little bit about the App Store and app development. So just taking a step back, my understanding from your testimony today is that essentially Apple has to operate by the same rules that the app developers operate by in terms of being able to access the App Store. Is that correct?
We have 60 apps on the App Store. They go through the same rules that the 1.7 million do.
Okay. So here's kind of why I asked that question. My understanding is the App Store review guidelines tell app developers not to submit copycat apps. Is that correct?
I'm not totally familiar, but I believe that's the case because we were getting a number of apps that were essentially the same thing, a sort of a cookie cutter.
And I can represent to you, Mr. Cook, we've reviewed, our subcommittee staff has obviously reviewed the guidelines, and they say that app developers should have original ideas, that copycat ideas aren't fair, and Apple's customers don't want those. On the other hand, the app developer agreement, which you require every developer to agree to, does give Apple the right to copy other apps. And so the question is why one rule for the developers that compete with you and the opposite rule for Apple?
Congressman, I'm not familiar with that, but I could follow up with your office on it.
Well, I would appreciate if you could follow up with our office. My understanding, again, is that the app developer agreement explicitly says that Apple can use any information that an app developer provides to Apple for any person or any purpose. And so obviously you have complaints from any number of app developers who have testified before our committee. I, as I said, represent the state of Colorado. We heard from a company called Tile, which said that Apple had access to confidential information about the apps distributed by the App Store. And given that, juxtaposed against this language in the exclusive agreement, you can understand why we would have concerns about anti-competitive conduct.
Yeah, Congressman, we run the App Store to help developers, not hurt them. We respect innovation. It's what our company is built on. We would never steal somebody's IP. But I will follow up with your office on more detail on this.
Well, and I appreciate that, Mr. Cook, because I think to the extent that Apple were willing to commit, and I intend to ask Mr. Pichai similar line of questioning, because I believe this is consistent across multiple different platforms. To the extent Apple was willing to commit within the developer agreement to say that while you have access to that data, that you are not going to use that data and are not permitted to use that data to replicate your own app, a copycat app, if you will, that would certainly, in my view, be a reflection of a step away from any type of anti-competitive conduct. And it sounds like you'll follow up and we can learn more with respect to that issue. Mr. Pichai, similarly, there was an article just today, or excuse me, yesterday, from The Verge. The title is "Google Reportedly Keeps Tabs on Usage of Rival Android Apps to Develop Competitors." And I'll quote from the article, Google said that the data doesn't give information about how people behave while they're using individual apps, but it wouldn't say whether it had been used to develop competing apps. So I guess first, I take it you would confirm that Google does have access to confidential information or ultimately competitively sensitive information about apps on the Android devices?
Congressman, if I could clarify this. Today, we have an API which is available for other developers as long as users consent. This gives Android, which are for digital well-being. So at a high level, this data is available through a public API and other developers can avail as long as the users give consent to it.
So, Mr. Pichai, I just want to clarify, again, I'll quote from this article. The article refers to this data as sensitive data about other apps, including how often they're opened and for how long they're used. I'm not asking how you use that information. I'm just asking whether or not, in fact, what the article alleges it is correct, that you do have access to that data.
Yeah, with user consent and the APIs exist, yes, we do.
And does Google use
And it's
that?
critical for us to have access to that so that we can maintain the, this is how we understand and we can, improve resource usage of applications.
Understood.
We can have features like.
My time's limited, sorry. I just want to get to this core question. Given that Google does have access to that data, does Google use that data to develop competing apps? And if your answer is no, will Google commit to making the necessary changes within its Android developer app agreements to ensure that developers have that sense of clarity, that in fact the data will not be used for Google to be able to develop a competing application?
Congressman, like other businesses today, we do look at trends, and we, in fact, in Play Store, we do publish the number of installs of application, and we give ranges. And so there's a wide variety of way by which we try to understand what's happening in the market. But I appreciate your concern about making sure there's clarity in this area, and we'll continue to invest and give more clarity.
Yeah, I must, I guess, want to just follow very quickly, Mr. Chairman, if you're willing. So I guess I'm wondering if you can just answer that fundamental question. Does Google use that information to develop competing apps? I understand the purposes you've described in terms of how you use the information. I'm just asking if one of those, in fact, is to develop competing apps.
The gentleman's time has expired, but the witness may answer the question.
Congressman, because we try to understand what's going on in market and we are aware of popularity of apps, I don't want to. I want to be accurate in my answer, but in general, the primary use for that data is to improve the health of Android. But and any data we get, we have user consent for it, and we make it available through an API to other developers as well.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. McBath.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And gentlemen, thank you so much for spending so much of your time with us today. We really appreciate it. And many of you have mentioned John Lewis today and his fight for equality, and that I know that all my colleagues and I will carry on. Very quickly, can each of you simply commit to improving racial and gender equity at your companies, including Black leadership and women in your senior ranks? Just a yes or no answer, please. Mr. Zuckerberg.
Yes.
Mr. Cook.
Yes, I am very personally committed.
Thank you. Mr. Bezos.
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you. Mr. Pakai.
Yes, and we've made public commitments to this regard.
Thank you so much. Mr. Zuckerberg, in 2004, there were dozens of social media companies. Facebook distinguished itself from the competitors by focusing specifically on privacy. You had a short, clear privacy policy. It was just 950 words. It made a promise to users, and I quote, "We do not and will not use cookies to collect private information from any user." And you said, "will not." That's a commitment about the future, and that was 2004. Mr. Zuckerberg, today, does Facebook use cookies to collect private information on users?
Congresswoman, my understanding to that is no. We're not using cookies to collect private information about people who use our services, and I believe we've upheld that commitment.
Okay, thank you. So, Mr. Zuckerberg, do you think that your company would be as successful if it had started with today's cookies policy in place?
Congresswoman, I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to, but in general, cookies is not a big part of how we're collecting information. We've primarily used them to make sure that someone can stay logged in on the web. We use them to some degree for security, to make sure that you don't have someone trying to log in under a lot of different accounts for one computer or something like that.
So, Mr. Zuckerberg, once again, you do not use cookies.
Congresswoman, just to make
Yes
sure
or
I'm
no?
clear, we do use cookies.
Yes or no?
We do use cookies.
Okay.
Yes, we do use cookies.
Okay, so Mr. Zuckerberg, the bottom line here is that you broke a commitment to your users. And who can say if you may or may not do that again in the future? The reality is that Facebook's market power grew and Facebook sacrificed its users' policy. Mr. Bezos, my colleagues have touched on counterfeit goods, and I share their concerns very deeply. I'm also concerned about stolen goods. Mr. Bezos, are stolen goods sold on Amazon?
Congresswoman, not to my knowledge, although we're more than 1 million sellers, and so I'm sure that there have been stolen goods
Really, Mr.
sold on
Bezos?
Amazon.
Really, Mr. Bezos?
I'm sorry.
There's not? You don't believe that there is?
I
That
said-
surprises me.
No, I just said with over 1 million sellers, I'm sure that it has happened. But certainly, I don't think it's a large part of what we're selling.
Okay, so Mr. Bezos, basically then you're saying yes.
I guess so.
Okay, so I want to ask you about information that you require from sellers to prevent the sale of stolen goods. Do you require a real name and address, yes or no?
For sellers?
Once again, do you require a real name and address from sellers?
I believe we do. But let me get back to your office with I'd rather give you the accurate answer, but I think we do.
Right. And I'm aware that you are. So yes, you do require a name and address. Do you require a phone number, yes or no?
I don't know if it's required. I think we often have it, but I don't know.
So briefly then, how do you verify that each of these pieces of information is accurate?
I don't know the answer to your question.
So you don't know how many people work on verifying seller verification before the seller is allowed to sell on Amazon?
No, Congresswoman, I don't.
Okay, then I'm going to ask you, sir, will you commit to reporting all sales of stolen and counterfeit goods to law enforcement? And 2, victims to track large-scale offenders engaged in organized retail crime?
To the degree that we're aware of it, we will certainly pursue it. In fact, I would.
Sir, can you just make a blanket commitment? Can you just make a blanket commitment, whether you're aware of it or not?
A blanket commitment to what? Sorry, Congresswoman, I'm trying to be helpful.
Reporting all sales of stolen and counterfeit goods to law enforcement and to victims to track large-scale offenders engaged in organized retail crime.
I see no reason why, if we're aware of stolen goods, we wouldn't report it. We would want the correct law enforcement authorities to be involved.
Okay, thank you so much. I yield back my time.
Thank the gentlelady for yielding back. I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony today and my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. I also want to acknowledge the extraordinary work of our team, led by Slade Bond, Lena Khan, Amanda Lewis, Phil Barenbrook, Anna Leinhardt, and Joe Venoy, who have done an extraordinary job throughout this investigation and in preparation for our hearing today. Today, we had the opportunity to hear from the decision makers at 4 of the most powerful companies in the world. This hearing has made one fact clear to me. These companies, as they exist today, have monopoly power. Some need to be broken up, all need to be properly regulated and held accountable. We need to ensure the antitrust laws first written more than a century ago work in the digital age. When these laws were written, the monopolists were men named Rockefeller and Carnegie. Their control of the marketplace allowed them to do whatever it took to crush independent businesses and expand their own power. Well, the names have changed, but the story is the same. Today, the men are named Zuckerberg, Cook, Pichai, and Bezos. Once again, their control of the marketplace allows them to do whatever it takes to crush independent business and expand their own power. This must end. This subcommittee will next publish a report on the findings of our investigation. We will propose solutions to the problems before us. As a great American Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis once said, we must make our choice. We may have democracy or we may have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both. This concludes today's hearing. Thank you again to our witnesses for attending. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the record. And without objection, this hearing is adjourned.
应该不会是拆分的节奏啊，因为他们在里面也说了，就是很多地方都是怎么说呢？你拆分了以后，他也提出来一个也提出来一个 example 嘛，AT&T 在19几年的时候拆分了，但是屁都没用，他们就是最后拆分了也会越变越强，而且拆分的话，说明就真的是名义上的拆分，但是背后还是会合作起来，所以他们估计会怎么样呢？我觉得很可能就是罚款嘛，罚款在就是帮助就是因为他们现在 government 的 budget 它钱非常少就怎么说呢？他们欠很多钱，对吧？政府欠很多钱，那要干嘛呢？就像警察开罚单一样，对吧？你看到一个人超速或者 觉得要超速的，就是去让他们开个罚单，然后套点钱，然后呢，真的有什么怎么说呢？真的有什么就是有什么 regulation 吗？我倒感觉。一时半会儿不会出任何东西，他们最快的可能就是罚款，而且罚款也没鸟用，跟他们那个挣的钱来说，真的是杯水车薪的，对吧？但是这个接下来可能会最坏的就是怎么说呢？就是新闻可能会慢慢的开始 speculate 就是可能会往坏的吹，也可能会往好的吹，对吧？就感觉真的是这次 committee 你看。问的问题都是像屎一样的，而且都是怎么说？你问问题又不是想要很多问题，90%的问题你问问题了，没有是为了想要拿到一个 answer，而是你知道这个，你知道他们会是怎么说，你知道事实，你已经自己想好答案了，你自己都知道你这个问题的答案是什么，你还要明摆着去明知故问一下，问来干嘛呢？对吧？那他们又回答了你，你又怎么样了？对吧？又能 advance， 就没有什么进展，对吧？所以说实话真的是浪费时间，然后，对呀，到最后看看他们接下来那个新闻怎么说，因为看新闻的话也可以看得出庄家他想把这个怎么推吧，对吧？对，说实话可能就是真的屁事都没有的，关键还是看明天的那个，明天他们以后的财报，对，财报如果一起也可能一起都一起涨起来，涨个可能5%到7%，对吧？这种大公司不会财报涨太多的，但涨完以后会不会就大家一起套利了就走了，对吧？所以这也是个问题反正，哎，真的是现在怎么说呢？就是特别的不明了，这个走势对，那今天先就这样对，好，那就先这样了，拜拜，大家拜拜记得明天大家那个怎么说呢小心啊，好，拜拜。